Chapter 1469. Zhang and I didn't care about the ifs and interrupted his daydream. She snorted and said, "In the end you still have to hide here like a stray dog." Su Fengnian laughed and said, "If I'm a stray dog, how much better are you? Wouldn't we be a cheating couple?" For the first time Zhang and I didn't talk back. She remained silent. Su Fengnian sat up with difficulty and looked at the lights outside the window. Tuoba Bodhisattva will definitely recover faster than me. With Li Mibi, who is good at killing and setting up ambushes, we can only delay and go south. We can only wait for Su Yanbing and Tantai Pingjing to bring people south and force Tuoba Bodhisattva and Li Mibi to give up. I believe that in at most half a day, the two of them will give up and secretly return to northern Mang. This gamble is very risky for both sides. Even if Li Mibi is willing to take Tuoba Bodhisattva and gamble with me, Beimang won't agree. Tuoba Bodhisattva knows the severity of the situation. Zhang and I coldly asked, "When will you be able to walk on the ground?" Su Fengnian smiled bitterly and said, "It will probably take another 2 days. Tuoba Bodhisattva and Li Mibi will probably only need 1 day to follow the tracks to Snow Lotus City. This means that you will probably have to fight again. Of course, this is the worst outcome. If my luck is not so bad, they might already be on their way back to the north." Su Fengnian suddenly looked tired and said helplessly, "But my luck doesn't seem to be very good now." Zhang and I frowned and said, "How can you ask people for Snow Lotus with your half-dead appearance?" Su Fengnian laughed and said, "Don't tell me you think that there is no place for Beiliang to hide our strength in Snow Lotus City?" Zhang and I couldn't help but turn around and ask, "Is this inn run by a spy from Beiliang?" Su Fengnian joked, "Do you think it will be so shabby?" Zhang and I, who hated being led by the nose by this guy, glared at him. Su Fengnian leaned against the bed and said with a smile, "Can I trouble you to ask the old innkeeper for supper?" Zhang and I hesitated for a moment, but still went downstairs to ask for a portion of food from the unlucky old man with the slanted eyebrows. Then she asked for an extra room on the 3rd floor. Since the inn didn't ask for any money from them from the start to the end, she felt at ease and acted extravagantly. Su Fengnian only saw the old innkeeper enter the room with the food box, but did not see her figure. She let out a sigh of relief and said with a smile, "Innkeeper, don't worry. I won't shortchange you for the accommodation. I don't know if the innkeeper has any connections at the Snow Lotus House. I heard that the Snow Lotus House in Snow Lotus City is a first-class brothel in the southern part of the western regions. Whether you can buy Snow Lotus here depends on fate, but whether you can eat the women of the Snow Lotus House depends on whether you have enough money in your pocket. As for me, I have a little bit of money. I want to take advantage of the fact that we are sleeping in separate rooms and take advantage of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make a trip to Snow Lotus City worth it." The aged shopkeeper immediately smiled knowingly, but he soon frowned and said cautiously, "To tell you the truth, the inns and restaurants in the city all have these big and small connections. They just think about how to serve the guests well and how to come and go in high spirits. Since the old man's pleasure in dares to use such a name, of course, we have our own methods. However, young master may not know that the girls in the Snow Lotus Tower are very arrogant, just like the concubines in the palace. No matter what status they have, those girls will not go out of the tower to receive guests. However, the girls from the other families are not so particular. This old man can make connections with them and let them come here prettily without anyone noticing. I guarantee that young master won't know about it. Moreover, young master's taste can also be decided in advance. Taking a step back, if young master is afraid that they are not to your taste, this old man can also sell my old face and let them come here more. Young master can choose the ones that you like. Young master, what do you think?" Su Fengnian shook his head and said with a smile, "Forget about the girls of the other alleys. We are eating the signature of the Snow Lotus House. Whether the girls are beautiful or not is not the most important thing. When we go back, we can brag about it to our brothers. Otherwise, we can eat anywhere. Can the girls of Snow Lotus City really be more beautiful than the courtesans of the Central Plains? Innkeeper, don't you think this makes sense? How about this? Shopkeeper, I used to have a friend who was a regular customer of the Snow Lotus House. He spent thousands of taels of silver there. You go to the brothel keeper of the Snow Lotus House and tell her that there is a friend of young Master Su in Fushui Prefecture who wants to have a drink with the courtesans in the house. Let them pay the price. As long as they dare to bid, I will dare to bid. Innkeeper, as long as you pass the message, no matter whether the deal is successful or not, when we check out and settle the bill, I will add the extra carriage fee. When the old innkeeper heard this, he was overjoyed and ran to pull the strings. Not long after, Su Fengnian saw the door open. She stood there with a fake smile. Without waiting for him to explain anything, she slammed the door and left. Less than an hour later, the door was gently knocked. Su Fengnian said calmly, "Come in." Two women walked into the room and deliberately changed into ordinary clothes. However, when they took off the veil that covered their faces, one of them was a middle-aged woman and the other was in the prime of her youth. Both of them were outstanding women who had their own romantic styles flowing from head to toe. After seeing Su Fengnian's appearance, the young woman's eyes were filled with curiosity and scrutiny. The plump woman, who had been trembling with fear along the way, was so scared that she directly dropped to her knees. She didn't dare to say anything and didn't even dare to breathe heavily. Su Fengnian said softly, "Mrs. Song, please get up. Sit down and talk." Even Lu Qiuo, who is known as a heartless and unscrupulous person in Liyang, secretly respects Mrs. Song. The woman's eyes were red. After getting up, she curtsied and sat down. Su Fengnian asked with a smile, "Is this the next courtesan Yu Qingling of Snow Lotus House?" The woman, who had already recognized Su Fengnian, nodded and replied respectfully, "Yu Qingling is an orphan in the Snow Lotus City. She entered the Snow Lotus House since she was a child. She's my confidant. However, for the sake of caution, she was only registered in the third classroom of the Whispering Room 4 years ago. Last year, she made a small contribution and was promoted to the second classroom this spring. Currently, she is in charge of keeping an eye on the number 1 local snake, Lu Huaishi. This person is nicknamed General Lu. He was born and raised in Snow Lotus House. He has more than 1,000 men under his command and is also very influential in Nanzhao. Among them, several familiar forces are deeply grateful to Lu Huaishi. I suspect that Lu Huaishi was first supported by Zhao Go of Liyang. However, 3 of Zhao Go's spies died one after another in autumn and winter last year. Whether Lu Huaishi has been instigated by Beimang or Shishu, we need Yu Qingling to find clues. If Yu Qingling can recruit people for Fu Shui House, she will be worthy of her status as a second classroom. Su Fengnian smiled and said, Lu Huaishi was able to move between several major forces and constantly grow his strength. First, he stood out from the crowd. After he gained a firm foothold, he became a feudal lord in the southern part of the western regions at the age of 35. Such a bold and ruthless person naturally has a lot of charisma. According to the spy report, even the daughter of Nanzhao's royal prince Li Yong was willing to be his woman behind the scenes and didn't hesitate to elope for him. The woman looked at the woman who was standing there in a daze and didn't know what to do. She smiled gently and said, "It's best if a sheep enters the tiger's mouth and can retreat after success. It wouldn't be strange even if there are no bones left. However, if you help the tiger do evil, you deserve to die." Since Yu Qingling has joined the Whispering Room, she can distinguish between public and private matters. Her next sentence fully displayed Madame Song's iron-blooded demeanor as a top spy. "If there is a mistake, this servant will clean up the house myself without the need for the Whispering Room's instructions. This servant will also ask head shopkeeper Chu for punishment if I don't know how to use people." Yu Qingling bit her lips and stood there elegantly, which made her look even more pitiful. Su Fengnian didn't comment. He looked at the beautiful woman who was well known in Snow Lotus City and said, "Yu Qingling, what kind of person do you think Lu Huaishi is? Tell me the truth." She still couldn't guess who this young master was. However, since Madame Song, who had the nickname of Empress Dowager in Snow Lotus House, was so serious about this matter and didn't hesitate to humiliate herself to the point of calling herself the servant, Yu Qingling believed that this young master must be an important person of the Whispering Room who had come to Snow Lotus City. Although she was nervous, she carefully chose her words and replied, "He is cruel and merciless, but he is affectionate and loyal." Su Fengnian smiled and dismissed it. "Is there any ready-made Snow Lotus in Snow Lotus City recently?" Chapter 1470. The woman said, "What a coincidence. Not only is there one, but there are 2 of them. One was found by Lu Huaishi's mansion and the other was found by the young man in the city from his father's last words. He waited for 6 years and went to the Snow Mountain 4 times to check on the lotus bud. After much effort, he finally found it this year. The former was waiting for a good price. It was rumored that Lu Huaishi's original intention was to give the snow lotus to the commandery prince of Nanzhao as an apology to his father-in-law. Later it seemed that the weaving bureau of Shishu in Nanjiang wanted to buy it and give it to the current empress. However, there was also a top master from the Central Plains who had been waiting for many years. He said that he was willing to sell his life for Lu Huaishi in exchange for the snow lotus. It seemed that he wanted to cure a woman's illness. After the young man brought the snow lotus and carried an old man who lost his legs back to the city, the various forces started a new round of competition. After all, the snow lotus was too rare. It was sold at a high price of 30,000 taels of silver 30 years ago. Now it was even more priceless. Even 100,000 taels of silver might not be enough to buy it. However, the ignorant young man was stubborn. He said that he did not want to sell his snow lotus and only wanted to give it to a girl from Ma family fort. The girl was the daughter of the Ma family fort's fort master. Her father had already arranged a marriage between the two families. Perhaps she had some interaction with the young man, which made the young man so stubborn that he was willing to risk his life for the snow lotus. Right now, the young man and the snow lotus stored in the ice cellar are blocked at the door by that Central Plains master. The two of them must have reached some kind of agreement. Without the protection of that Grand Master of Swordsmanship, the young man's corpse would have been long gone. Song Fu lowered his voice and asked, "Do you need the Snow Lotus house to fight for the two Snow Lotuses?" Su Fingyan waved his hand and said, "There's no need for the Snow Lotus house to get involved. Just tell me the exact location of the two Snow Lotuses." Madame Song's eyes were burning with determination. She said in a low voice, "Since the Fushui house set up the Snow Lotus house in this city, is it just for show? How many people have died at the border between Liang and Yu? Even if the Snow Lotus house is wiped out, how many people can die?" Su Fingyan smiled and said, "Madame Song said that the Snow Lotus house is fair. I should do the same." Madame Song shook her head. "It's not the same." Su Fingyan looked at the woman who seemed ready to die at any moment and said calmly, "I have the final say." Mrs. Song was stunned. Su Fingyan glanced at the door, coughed and said to Madame Song, "I'll have to trouble Madame Song to ask the inn to prepare a carriage for me. I need to immediately go to the lotus-picking youth's place. Madame Song, you can just give the coachman directions. Oh right, give the innkeeper more money. If I need anything in the future, I will definitely look for your Snow Lotus house. If not, don't act on your own accord. Just treat it as the rules of the water room." The two carriages parted ways outside the inn. Madame Song sat in the carriage with an expressionless face. Yu Qingling, who was about to go to General Lu's residence to feed the tiger with her body, mustered up her courage to ask something. Madame Song, with her eyes closed, said coldly, "Don't ask what you shouldn't ask." In the other carriage, Su Fingyan sat leaning against the wall. Jiang and I sat upright with his back against the red sandalwood sword box. His expression was uncertain. After 7 or 8 turns, the carriage came to a narrow and dark alley. The simple and honest coachman stopped the carriage, lifted the curtain and said apologetically, "Young master, young miss, the alley is too small for the carriage to enter. You will have to walk 34 steps forward." Jiang and I got off the carriage first and said, "Walk by yourself using the wall." Su Fingyan had a bitter smile on his face. With the help of the coachman, he got off the carriage and told the coachman not to wait for them to return to the inn first. He really had to use the wall to walk. He was in a sorry state. Jiang Ni's steps were not big. She walked slowly, less than 6 steps in front of them. She did not forget to sneer, "If you go to that Snow Lotus house to spend the night, won't you be unable to walk by yourself tomorrow?" That was not all. She added, "Forget about the girls in the other alleys. We'll be eating the signature dishes of the Snow Lotus house." Teehee, you're indeed a hedonistic son of a wealthy family. These words sound like something only a veteran in the field of flowers could say. Su Fingyan laughed angrily. "Eavesdropping on other people's conversation makes you sound so righteous?" Jiang and I snorted. "My ears are sharp. Otherwise, do you think I'm happy to hear such filthy words?" The two came to a dilapidated yellow mud house without a wall. Jiang and I carried the red sandalwood sword box and stood with her arms crossed in front of her chest. Su Fingyan had to put one hand on her shoulder to stabilize himself. However, she dodged, so Su Fingyan had to bend over with his hands on his knees. A middle-aged man with a sword on his knees was sitting on the stairs in front of the house. He should be the swordsman from the Central Plains who was known as a Grand Master of martial arts in the eyes of Snow Lotus City. Su Fingyan did not know this person. It seemed that this person who had stayed in Snow Lotus City for 4 or 5 years did not recognize him and Zhang and I. As for those guys lurking in the darkness, Su Fengnian knew that a skinny camel was still bigger than a horse. Although he was weak and could be blown away by the wind, he could sense clearly with his will of divine. Although he could not defeat Li Mixi and Tuoba Bodhisattva, he could kill them all without lifting a finger. Moreover, he had Zhang and I by his side. As long as it was not the 14 people of Wu Ping or the great grandmaster who was only one step away from getting involved, it would not be a problem. The swordsman looked straight ahead and said indifferently, I don't care about Lu Huaishi's Snow Lotus, but I have already reserved the one in the house. You can leave now. If you don't want to give up, you can ask my sword. Su Fengnian gasped for breath and raised his head to stare at the middle-aged swordsman who had the demeanor of a master. He asked with a smile, if I may be so bold as to ask, do you have a famous nickname? The swordsman did not answer. Instead, a hearty and loud voice came from the house. What bullsh *T hero? This old man was defeated by Dong Yuanrui of Dongyue in the past. He could be defeated with one hand. Jiang Hu is getting more and more ridiculous today. How can this kind of trash be considered a person with a broken sword? This old man's generation was really full of heroes. Let's not talk about others. Let's talk about those who fought with this old man. There was the overlord of Cold Land, Wang Xiu, who used a spear, and the green-robed ancestor of Fengdu. They could barely be considered masters. When this old man fought with them, it was just a warm-up. Only the swordsman with the surname Li was this old man's fated enemy. However, they appreciated each other. However, a young voice in the house interrupted the old man's irrelevant boasting. All right. I carried you out of the cave in the snow-capped mountain. A real man does not boast about his past achievements, do you know that? Eat your pancake. Su Fengnian was confused. He turned to look at Zhang and I. The corner of her mouth moved and she said coldly, there is no such person. The old man with the sheepskin fur coat never mentioned him to me. Su Fengnian whispered. His qi is not even at the level of level 2 master now. I think he will barely reach the threshold of level 1 when he is at his peak. However, his qi is even more powerful than old man Li's. Then Su Fengnian saw Zhang and I walking forward and asked, what are you doing? Zhang and I said indifferently, go in and beat him up. So that he won't be boasting without a draft. Su Fengnian did not know whether to laugh or cry. He is already so old. Why can't I have a taste of my mouth? Moreover, he was full of pride. Didn't he still put old man Li at the top of the list? Just based on this point, I want to drink a few bowls of wine with this old senior. Only then did Zhang and I stop, but she suddenly turned her head to look at the corner of the alley. Su Fengnian followed her line of sight and saw a budding young girl leading a juju-bred horse. She had a kind of indomitable will that only a newborn calf would have, and she would not care about anything. After the young girl walked into the tiger's den, she looked at Su Fengnian cautiously. When she saw Zhang and I, she smiled. This made Su Fengnian a little depressed. The young girl led the horse and shouted, Hong Shuji, don't be stupid. Quickly find a buyer for that snow lotus. Do you hear me? That's all I have to say. I'm leaving. The young girl's back was facing the house. She tried not to make it too obvious that she was crying. In the future, we will go our separate ways. A sallow and emaciated young man rushed out of the house. His face was full of tears. He wiped his tears with his hand and shouted, Ma Gong, your father said that as long as I pluck the snow lotus, he will not let you marry that bastard. The young girl turned her head and said angrily, My father only wants you to die in the snow mountain, you idiot. So what if you pluck the snow lotus? The young girl raised her hand to cover her face. She sobbed, We can't be together. The young man also cried, I don't care. I don't want you to be with me now. Anyway, that guy is not a good person. As long as you don't marry him, it will be fine. I will be very happy. Su Fengnian was still bent over. His expression could not be seen clearly. Then Zhang and I walked closer and kicked his calf. Su Fengnian asked, What's wrong? She widened her eyes and said angrily, You don't care? She quickly added fiercely, If you don't care, I will. Su Fengnian smiled. He put one hand on his back and slowly straightened his back. He smiled brightly, Let me take a breather first. Care, how can I not care? Su Fengnian looked at the young man and the young girl. He sighed, That's great. Chapter 1471. The dilapidated house, the bright moonlight and the gloomy and cold alley. There was a Wu Dao grandmaster holding a sword, a sad skinny boy, a young girl holding a whip, a sick man gasping for breath, and a beautiful woman carrying a purple box on her back. In the eyes of the sneaky night walkers lying on the roofs, the scene in front of them made them feel less bored after coming here in the middle of the night. The night walkers were divided into several groups, each with their own benefactor. Among them, the ones with the largest numbers and the aura of a battlefield were the elite soldiers from Lu Huaxi's mansion. They also rightfully occupied the two adjacent roofs with the widest view. The weapons hanging from their waists were all sabers, but there were a variety of them. There were Miaodao with a slender blade that looked like a seedling, and there were also sabers that came from the southern dynasties of Beimang to the western regions. There was even an old cold saber carried by a man in black who looked like a leader. Only those who were familiar with the Beiliang frontier army could tell that it was a cavalry saber with a more prominent curve than a walking saber. As Beiliang became stricter with the control of the sabers and crossbows, the value of these cold sabers spread among the people in the early years also rose. They could easily be sold for a sky-high price of 700 to 800 taels of silver. On Liang Lake, if there was a cold saber hanging from one's waist, as long as it was not the kind of person who could see through it at a glance, people would involuntarily be afraid of it. A guy approached the man in black who carried the cold saber and whispered, "Leader Qi, the woman below with the purple box on her back is really beautiful. She's even more beautiful than the purple bamboo fairy who came to our mansion as a guest. Why don't we just take action? The whole Snow Lotus city is ours. As long as we enter the city, our lives will be in our hands. Leader Qi, didn't the general say that you need a wife? I think this woman is very good. We just discussed that we'll send the Snow Lotus to the general's mansion, and tie this woman directly to your mansion. Today we'll hold a wedding banquet for you and make a scene in the bridal chamber. Then we won't waste our night in the cold." The man in black, who had been instigated by his subordinates to become a mountain king, subconsciously stroked his scabbard. His rationality overcame his desire. He shook his head and said, "Don't ruin my foster father's great plans." He was the direct subordinate of Lu Huaixi, the Earth Emperor of Snow Lotus City. He had once followed Lu Huaixi in and out of the 100,000 Great Mountains, which was why he was bestowed with this cold saber that Lu Huaixi loved so much. His purpose on this trip was to keep an eye on that Central Plains man who wielded a sword. Lu Huaixi was determined to obtain that Snow Lotus because he had publicly announced that he would offer it to a woman with the same name in Western Shu. It was said that she was an extremely beautiful woman, but it was a pity that she was in existence that even Lu Huaixi could not afford to offend. The Snow Lotus obtained by the lotus picker in his residence had another secret use. Because he was one of Lu Huaxi's followers who had followed Lu Huaixi since his youth, he was qualified to come into contact with some of the inside stories. It was said that there were 10 new sects in Liyang, and the Dragon Palace of Nanjiang was one of them. The new palace master Lin Hongyuan was not only the leader of the Jianghu in Nanjiang, but also had a close relationship with His Royal Highness, Zhao Zhu, the King of Yan. He did not know what his foster father was plotting, but it was definitely not limited to Snow Lotus City. His foster father had secretly revealed his yearning for the Central Plains more than once. "Boss Chi, look. That guy seems to be reckless and wants to interfere. What should we do?" The dragon moth adopted by Lu Huaixi frowned and squeezed out a word from between his teeth. "Wait." The tuberculosis ghost who had come out of nowhere to mess things up called the young boy and girl to the side and muttered to them like a lousy accountant. Sure enough, the young boy's face was full of suspicion, while the young girl with an extraordinary background was not tempted at all. It was one thing for the young boy and girl to have a wide vision, but in the face of a great change they were still a little wary. Who would believe that a stranger who appeared out of nowhere, who could easily push them down with a single finger, would paint a big picture for them out of thin air? When the dragon moth on the roof stole a glance at the stunning woman, especially when he saw her looking at the scholarly young man, he who had always thought himself to be hard-hearted, suddenly felt his blood boil. Then he elegantly jumped down. More than a dozen brothers who had depended on each other for many years also did not want to be left behind, and they all landed on the ground one after another. Apart from the 3 archers who stayed on the roof in tacit understanding, the rest of them were all ready to help the dragon moth on the roof. Everyone had a frivolous smile on their faces, and they almost called the woman sister-in-law. Su Fengyan was talking until his mouth was dry. He told the young boy that as long as he had Snow Lotus, he could guarantee that the young girl would not get married. In fact, the young boy was somewhat tempted. However, the young girl who came from a wealthy family outside of Snow Lotus City mercilessly exposed his lie. Su Fengnian said that he could protect them and safely leave Snow Lotus City. She said that he had to fight with the swordsman from the Central Plains on the steps first, and then they could talk about other things after he won. Su Fengnian said that he could. She then said that there were many experts around General Lu in the city. Her father's Ma family fort also had 100 cavalrymen and 200 archers. Not only did he have to defeat the swordsman, he also had to go to the general's mansion and fight with the Ma family fort. Su Fengnian was originally afraid that the two children would misunderstand his lack of sincerity if he agreed too quickly, so he casually asked how powerful Lu Huaishi was. As a result, the young girl rolled her eyes at him and said that he was actually a Jianghu swindler who wanted to do business without any capital. He just wanted to cheat the Snow Lotus and then quickly run away. Su Fengnian's physical strength was exhausted, so he squatted down. When he raised his head and was about to speak, the young girl looked down on him even more. She considerately told Su Fengnian to just lie down and talk. This way his legs wouldn't hurt and his waist wouldn't hurt. Su Fengnian laughed and said that the real experts in Jianghu didn't fly around and pretend to be masters. They all liked to pretend to be weak and subservient like him. The young girl's mouth was unforgiving. She said that Su Fengnian wasn't pretending to be subservient and was a real subservient. The young boy who had been watching from the side wanted to laugh, but he held back his laughter. He secretly made a face at Su Fengnian, taking pleasure in his misfortune. Su Fengnian laughed and scolded the young boy. She hasn't married into the family yet, but she's already in charge of both internal and external affairs. Aren't you afraid that your husband's authority will be lowered in the future? The young boy, who was simple and honest but wasn't really stupid, chuckled. The young girl flew into a rage. She gripped her horsewhip tightly and pointed it at the guy who was speaking more and more nonsense. Her face was frosty and she wanted him to get lost. In the end, Su Fengnian's next words made her completely calm down. What's wrong? Now that Hong Shuji is in danger, your conscience is uneasy, and you want me and that beautiful big sister, two outsiders, to stay out of this matter even if it doesn't work out? Girl, aren't you a little too soft-hearted? Lu Huaishi's lackeys were about to fight when the person with the cold blade at his waist raised his hand to stop them. He said softly, "Something's not right." Then a wild laughter came from inside the house. You bunch of idiots who don't know Buddha when you meet a real Buddha. What the hell are you shouting about? Like a wild horse, a figure broke through the paper-like walls of the mud house and floated out. First, it jumped over the head of the swordsman who didn't move at all. Then it passed between Su Fengnian and Zhang and I. Finally, it crashed into the ranks of Lu Huaishi's elite soldiers. The Lu family's bodhisattva, who had been fighting for a long time, shouted angrily. He pulled out his blade and held it with both hands. Using his body to push the blade forward, he rushed forward quickly. His steps were not in a straight line, but were unusually complicated and agile. It was a mixture of the Western Shu Xingyi and the Southern Tang Tongbi style. His movements were very clean. The figure that rushed out of the house flashed and brushed past the bodhisattva in the blink of an eye. Not only did he kick the bodhisattva's chest, he also took the blade with his bare hands. The bodhisattva's momentum did not decrease. He rushed straight to the mottled wall of the alley, stabbed the blade into the wall and flipped over. When the young man who was respectfully called Head Chi stopped staggering and turned his head to look, he saw an old man whose two calves seemed to have been cut off by a sharp weapon. The old man was sitting on his beloved blade. He looked around complacently and said loudly, "Yo, young man, you have some weight. Unfortunately, you have encountered this old man. Even if I give you 20 years of hard work, it still won't be enough." The domineering old man glanced at the middle-aged swordsman who did not stop him from leaving the house and said indignantly, "This old man has returned to Jianghu this time and waited in this shabby little town for so many days. Other than that blockhead on the stairs who only has a killing sword but not a heart, no one actually took the initiative to burn incense and worship the gods? Do you really want this old man to start a massacre so that you ignorant frogs at the bottom of the well will understand that there is a land immortal in your Snow Lotus City?" The head chi of Snow Lotus City turned his head and spat out a mouthful of blood. His eyes were malicious and cold. He shook his wrist and asked with a smile, "Old Immortal, do you really want to be the enemy of the general's residence?" The old man laughed and said, "What bullshit general's residence? A bunch of blind people. If you really annoy this old man, he will kill you all in an instant." At this time, Su Fengyan smiled at Jiang and I, who had quietly walked a few steps closer to him, and said, "Learn from him. Look at how the old senior walks the Jianghu. Let me tell you, in our line of work, if you don't know how to smile evilly, then you are definitely a fledgling of the Jianghu. Similarly, the evil experts in the Jianghu, this kind of laughter is only a beginner's skill. As for the righteous experts, they must have the demeanor of an immortal. After one move, they must stand with their hands behind their back. At night, especially on a moonlit night, it is the best scene. Think about it, if you put on the posture of looking up at the moon, you will have the demeanor of a great master and won't hurt your eyes. But there's a way, and that's to narrow your eyes and remain silent. Don't speak at all. You can't speak big words. Once you do, it'll lower your status. If you don't say anything, it'll make the bystanders like us feel that you're unfathomable." Jiang and I said unhappily, "You are so boring." Su Fengyan glared at him and said, "This is the priceless advice that I personally came up with after wandering the Jianghu. If others want to listen to it, I will not sell it to them." The Ma Jiabao's daughter, who was eavesdropping on Su Fengyan's teaching, quickly exposed him. "You are indeed an experienced Jianghu swindler." Chapter 1472. The young man listened with great interest. He felt that these words made a lot of sense. Every time those rich kids in Snow Lotus City flirted with girls on the street, didn't they like that kind of devilish smile? Also, every time they opened their folding fans, they would open them with a crisp sound and close them with a snap. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't learn that kind of smile. Of course, he couldn't afford that kind of fan either. Therefore, the young man was filled with curiosity and asked softly, "Is there anything else?" Su Fengyan proudly snorted and said, "Yes, there is. The knowledge behind this is as deep as the sea. Kid, let me ask you, are there any heroines in Snow Lotus City whose nickname starts with the character Z? They either like to wear purple clothes or wear purple accessories. There must be some, right?" The young man was startled, and his eyes were filled with admiration. He nodded vigorously and said, "Young master, you are amazing. In this year there were 3 or 4 immortal sisters who were like this." The young girl curled her lips and said, "What's so great about being able to guess this kind of thing? In Snow Lotus City, there are many young heroes who wear white robes and have 2 blades hanging from their waists. Every one of them claims to be someone's closed-door disciple. They either like to lie on the street drunk and look at the moon, climb up the city wall and pretend to be in a daze, or they like to run to the Snow Lotus Pavilion to show off their poetry. My father said that although they are somewhat skilled, they are still far from the top experts in Snow Lotus City. He also said that these young heroes either had their brains kicked by a donkey when they were young, or their brains were clamped by a door when they grew up. He also said that if I see them, I must avoid them." Su Fengyan said earnestly, "Little girl, you don't understand. These young heroes with lofty ambitions are all young and promising. They have a bright future ahead of them. They will definitely become great heroes in the future." The young girl didn't pay any attention to this guy. She fiercely glared at the young man Hong Shuji and said, "Immortal sister?" The young man shrunk his neck and had a sudden inspiration. He began to apply what he had just learned and looked up at the moon. After the old man spoke, the tense situation suddenly took a turn for the worse. "This old man has heard of some of your master Lu Huaishi's deeds. He is clearly an ambitious person. Send a message to that whatever general's mansion. Tell him that as long as the one surnamed Lu is willing to offer 10 famous swords, 1,000 taels of gold and a mansion with 100 maidservants, this old man will reluctantly become his chief guest. Even if he faces the top 10 experts in the world in the future, he will have the confidence to challenge them." The young man surnamed Qi, who still had blood on the corner of his mouth, looked uncertain. Finally he smiled and cupped his fists. "As long as you can take down that eyesore swordsman and let me take the Snow Lotus, I will try my best to introduce you to my foster father." The youth panicked and shouted, "Old man, didn't you say you wanted to take me as your disciple? Didn't you say you would teach me the peerless martial arts that can easily make me the strongest person in the world?" The old man laughed and said, "Silly boy, with your coarse constitution, even if this old man gave you dozens of top-secret manuals, you still wouldn't be able to become an expert. If this old man hadn't said that, would you have helped me break the formation in the cave?" The old man suddenly looked at the sickly young man. "Your aptitude is just so. Do you want to be my disciple? This old man has made a comeback this time and is destined to be famous. As long as you agree, this old man will let you rise to the top. The old man changed the topic and looked at the young woman with the purple box on her back. She was really stunning. Even when he was unscrupulous in Jianghu, he had never seen such a beautiful woman. If he could use her as a cauldron, he might be able to return to the peak of martial arts. The old man didn't hide his greedy eyes. He smacked his lips and said with a smile, "However, the girl beside you will belong to this old man. Such a first-grade cauldron, if I don't take it, I will be punished. As for you, young man, a girl is nothing. As long as you have the world's first-grade martial arts." Su Fengyan smiled and said, All right. I originally wanted to talk with you a bit. I wanted to hear about the Jianghu that the old man wearing the sheepskin coat was in. You, after all, are a Jianghu senior who fought with Dong Yuanrui of the Dongyue Sword Pond. Although you lost miserably and had your legs chopped off by the 6 caterpillars, it is not easy for you to live to this age. But since you can't accept it, then there is no other way. You should thank me. If it wasn't for me, you would be a corpse now. Jiang and I snorted coldly. Su Fengyan's smile disappeared. Speaking of which, if I'm not wrong, you're that notorious cauldron casting master, right? You're good at using women as cauldrons and using yin to supplement yang to increase your own cultivation. Even the devil sex deer chasing mountain isn't willing to accept you. Dong Yuanrui 6 caterpillars tripod casting master Deer Mountain. The old man who had struggled to break free from the prison in the snow-capped mountain cave was greatly shocked. Su Fengyan was probably tired from talking so much. He squatted down again and panted lightly. Except for Jiang and I, everyone was dumbfounded. Even the swordsman from the Central Plains turned pale with fright. Because no matter how hard he tried to suppress the sword across his knees, it would automatically fly out of the sheath. The flying sword slowly came to Su Fengyan's shoulder and slightly hummed, like a little bird relying on a man, like an old horse meeting its master. The old man was scared to death. He had been away from Jianghu for many years, but his eyesight was still there. The sword-controlling art of the Wu family's sword tomb. Chapter 1473. The old man hurriedly shouted, "Young master, let's talk nicely. Don't fight. It's not easy for you and me to reach our current cultivation." The flying sword pierced forward like a bolt of lightning. The old man couldn't care less about maintaining his posture of a cross-legged expert. He quickly jumped up a few feet and dodged the flying sword that nailed into the wall. The tip of the flying sword spun and retreated, leaving some yellow soil on the wall. After putting some distance between them, the flying sword pierced forward again. The old man, who had been pretending to be a grandmaster after leaving the house, knocked the wall with his elbow and tried to climb over the wall to escape. However, the flying sword suddenly accelerated and appeared above his head. The old man had no choice but to use the 1,000-pounds falling technique. The flying sword seemed to be teasing him. Every time, intentionally or unintentionally, the old man would be able to dodge the tip of the sword and avoid the miserable fate of being pierced through. However, he would never be able to leave the wall. The old lecher, who had been trapped in the snow mountain for dozens of years, felt like dying. He kept shouting some strange words that the people of Snow Lotus City couldn't understand. It's not the chi-controlling flying sword, it's the superior flying sword technique. Brat, who are you to the Wu family's sword tomb? Why is it that even though you didn't personally raise the other person's sword, it can still be guided by your divine intent? Could it be that you're the current Wu family's sword crown, and that girl is your sword maid? This old man knows his mistake, you brat. No, sir, please be merciful and spare her. What made the old man even more desperate was that the guy still had the leisure to raise his arm and pull out the knife, gently holding it in his hand. After half an hour, the exhausted old man was stabbed more than 20 times by the sword and hung on the wall through his mouth. The sword pierced through the wall so it looked like a hanging corpse. Su Fengyan held the cold knife and glanced at the corpse. As if he still couldn't vent his anger, the flying sword flew out and stabbed into the wall again and again at a speed that was countless times faster than before. A series of banging sounds rang out. The corpse didn't even slide down half an inch. It was pierced into a pile of meat paste bit by bit. Su Fengyan stood up. When he looked at Lu Huaishi's adopted son, the latter crashed into the wall and died on the spot. The wall collapsed and the two corpses disappeared from everyone's sight. What the eyes didn't see, their hearts didn't palpitate. After Su Fengyan sheathed his blade, he grabbed the scabbard that had flown back into his hand. He put the cold blade back into the scabbard and then hung it around his waist. Ignoring the group of night walkers in the alley and the Lu Manor who were about to wet their pants, he made a face at the young man and woman and said with a smile, "How is it? Do you believe me now? For a true expert like me, there's no need for me to stand. Squatting is already very cool. If I were to stand, I would look so handsome that I wouldn't even dare to look in the mirror for fear of scaring myself. How could there be such a handsome and peerless expert in this world?" Zhang and I rolled his eyes and said, "Immoral." The young man stood in front of the young girl to protect her. The young girl hid behind the young man. Her teeth chattered as she whispered, "He's powerful, but his head must have been hit by a door before." The stubborn young girl pulled the young man's sleeve and asked, "Isn't that right, Twig?" The young man whispered, "Yes." However, he quickly pretended to be stupid and said, "Really?" With a thought, Su Fengyan made the long sword that he had borrowed for a moment fly back into the scabbard of the swordsman. He smiled and said, "Thank you." The man from the Central Plains who had thought that he was already considered a top expert in the small Snow Lotus city of the western regions, stood up and said in a deep voice, "It should be me who is thanking Senior for teaching me how to use the sword." Su Fengyan dismissed him with a smile. Then his entire aura changed and he no longer showed any signs of being defeated. He turned his head and said to Zhang and I, "In fact, my recovery is not slow. In fact, it's even faster than Tuoba Bodhisattva. I could walk on my own 2 days ago. Now he and Li Mixi have entered the city. You have already saved me once. This time I have a chance of winning. It's not certain that I will lose. Don't worry about me. Take these 2 kids and leave Snow Lotus City first. After settling them down you can go back to West Chu." Su Fengyan paused for a moment. He blinked his eyes and said with a mischievous smile, "Maybe one day I will go and find you. At that time, you will know how powerful I am and whether I am the new martial emperor or not." Su Fengyan walked toward the alley alone. He pressed his right hand on the cold saber's hilt and turned his back to Zhang and I. "Back then when Chao Chongqing took you away I couldn't stop him. As long as I don't die this time no one can stop me." At this moment the young man and the young girl saw that the swordsman suddenly stagger and almost fall to the ground. The young girl, who had been inexplicably touched, couldn't help but laugh. "He looks more handsome when he is squatting." The young man nodded. The man from the Central Plains, who had already regarded the senior swordsman who was good at retaining his looks as an immortal, also couldn't bear to look. However, while he was filled with compassion, the swordsman was also shocked. Just now he seemed to have heard the names Tuoba Bodhisattva and Chao Chongqing. This senior was not only on the same side as Chao Chongqing, but his opponent was also the second strongest in the world, Tuoba Bodhisattva. He was even worthy of Tuoba Bodhisattva joining forces with others to hunt him down to Snow Lotus City. Was this senior a sword immortal who had never appeared in Jianghu? However, in the next moment he felt that it wasn't the case. In the distance, Zhang and I, whose face was stiff, came behind Su Fengyan with a long sweep. He kicked this guy to the ground and said angrily, "Are you addicted to pretending to be an expert?" Chapter 1474. Zhang and I stopped at the corner of the alley. During this escape, whether they should stop or continue, how they should fight if they stopped, whether it was a dragonfly skimming the water or not, it was all up to Su Fengyan. Tonight was not an exception. Slowly walking out of the alley, Su Fengyan gazed at the street. As expected, if one thought of the worst, that would be the case. It was very easy to worry about. If their luck was good, Li Mibi and Tuoba would enter the city half a day later. If their luck was average, the two would have already given up on him as bait and returned. Su Fengyan sighed and then looked at her with a complicated gaze. Zhang and I just quietly waited for the rest. Su Fengyan said softly, "This time we won't follow the old rules. We have to keep an eye on that old dog Li Mixi. Those battles where Bodhisattva Tuoba was the target were actually just a smokescreen. Now that Tuoba has recovered some of his strength, he is determined to leave. Without Su Yanbing and the others stopping him, we will not be able to stop him. But like we said before, if the worst situation occurs, you retreat first, I will cover the rear." Zhang and I did not comment. She hesitated and then asked, "Do you know why Beimang is so relaxed with Gu Jiantang guarding the east?" Su Fengyan asked in response, "Is it because they are certain that the Liyang Imperial Court will not move?" Zhang and I sneered, "So simple?" Su Fengyan leaned against the wall and said softly, There is news in the spy report that there is a group of people in Great Peace City who cannot hold back. They boldly suggested that the two Liao border armies should not just stare at each other and that they should cooperate with Beimang. Of course, they could not be considered as reinforcements, but they could be like Jizhou's Yuan Tingshan and obtain a lot of merits. However, these voices were quickly suppressed by Gu Jiantang. Among them, Su Gong, who had been patrolling the border as assistant minister, had been strongly in favor of fighting at the start. But when he suddenly changed sides and did not mention anything about attacking, he caused a lot of criticism in Great Peace City. His already low reputation hit rock bottom. Some people even said that they wanted this assistant minister of the Ministry of War to be an assistant minister of the border for the rest of his life. Fu Shui Chamber only knows that Lu Xingxiang sent an urgent letter to the capital, directly to the Imperial Study Room. As for what the letter said, Fu Shui Chamber does not have the ability to find out. Zhang and I wanted to say something but hesitated. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Let's not talk about it. I'll just treat it as an accident on the Eastern Front. In any case, I can't care about the life and death of the two Liao countries. If the Eastern Front is ruined, it will only be Gu Jiantang's headache." Zhang and I did not give a direct answer. Who do you think hates Gu Jiantang the most in the world? Su Fengnian paused. Gu Jiantang was able to become one of the 4 great generals of the spring and autumn period because of his contribution in destroying the country. Not to mention the southern Tang, they did not fight much. However, when they took down Dongyue, they fought some exciting battles. The only people who have a deep hatred for Gu Jiantang should be the people of Dongyue. Su Fengnian said to herself, but even the royal family of Dongyue has been subdued. Most of the slightly famous generals are dead. The civil officials of Dongyue were the first to submit to the Zhao clan in Liang. They became Zhang Julu's lackeys in the early years of the struggle between the Zhang and the Gu. In particular, almost half of the officials of the 5 departments outside of the Censorate and the Ministry of War were Dongyue civil officials. The most famous pair of censors, father and son, impeached Gu Jiantang's Ministry of War every year for 10 years after Yonghui Empress. But these people, to be honest, are just scratching an itch for Gu Jiantang, the pillar of the country. Perhaps Gu Jiantang of the 2 Liao countries would like them to scold him a few more times. Otherwise, he would not be able to hold his position. When a general is outside, he is never afraid of the civil officials of the internal court. On the contrary, he is afraid that his reputation is too good. Zhang and I sneered. Su Fengnian suddenly understood and said, "Oh." She asked doubtfully, "You really guessed it?" Su Fengnian nodded. Zhang and I curled her lips in disdain. Su Fengnian said, "Isn't it just Wang Sui?" She opened her eyes wide. Su Fengnian blinked. "Really?" She shook her head vigorously. Su Fengnian looked helpless. The 2 riders rushed to Snow Lotus City. After entering the city, the sound of the horses' hooves hitting the bluestone slabs seemed insignificant in the noisy nightless city. A few drunkards were squatting on the street outside the tavern to vomit. They inadvertently looked up and saw the faces of the 2 riders reflected in the dim light. They did not pay much attention to it. They could not suppress the movement of their throats and threw up in the direction of the 2 riders. After vomiting to their heart's content, they felt a lot more comfortable. However, they found that one of the white-haired riders was looking at them coldly. The drunkard grinned and wiped his mouth with his sleeve. Unexpectedly, as if lightning had ignited the fire on the ground, his stomach started to churn again. He put his hands on the ground and vomited. Then he felt that something was wrong. He shook his head and tried to open his eyes wide. Only then did he see a pool of blood on the slate. Then his head hit the ground heavily and he never had the chance to open his eyes again. Drunk to death, drunk to death. The drunkard died drunk like this. The other dispirited middle-aged rider did not say anything about the old man's venting of anger. If he were in the old man's shoes, he would also have the thought of killing people indiscriminately. The old man had set up 2 big traps. The first time was to kill Yan Wenwan. This time he wanted to kill Su Fengnian. Almost half of the top masters in Beimang Jianghu were killed. The most important thing was that they did not succeed. The spider web that spread all the way from the southern dynasties to Beiliang was also torn into pieces. No matter how calm the old man was, he could not help but feel angry. The white-haired old man probably also realized that he had lost his composure. He laughed at himself and said softly, "King of the Northern Courtyard, please allow me to make one last bet." I bet that the guy surnamed Su Fingyan will not be willing to let the fight end in a draw. He will personally take the risk and wait for us in Snow Lotus City to take the bait. Su Yanbing and Tantai Pingjing will arrive in about 12 hours. During this period, if Su Fingyan not only takes the initiative to show up, but also deliberately shows his flaws and runs in circles with us, I can promise you that no matter how rare the opportunity is, I will stop and return to the north with peace of mind. I will leave Snow Lotus City before Su Yanbing and Tantai Pingjing enter the city. Chapter 1475. Bodhisattva Tuoba nodded. To him, this battle of life and death between the two of them had already ended when the sword flew over. Bodhisattva Tuoba was able to accept defeat, but he was also able to let it go. At most, he could just change the game and fight again in the future. After this battle, Tuoba could use the stones of other mountains to polish jade. Whether it was his state of mind or cultivation, he had benefited greatly. Of course, at the same time, he had become a whetstone for Su Fingyan to temper his martial arts. It was inevitable that the battle to the death in the future would only be more dangerous. Tuoba was well aware of this. However, since Li Mixi had saved his life, Tuoba would follow the Shadow Prime Minister's wishes all the way down south. He would not deliberately raise a tiger for the sake of the battle for the number one person in the world. If he could kill Su Fingyan early on, Tuoba would not have any knot in his heart. Just as he had said to Su Fingyan before, in his eyes, Jianghu was nothing. Leaping into the Central Plains, he became the number one contributor to the founding of the new Beimang. Subsequently, he became the undisputed number one martial artist in the history books of later generations. In the past 800 years, the Great Qin dynasty had lost its tripod and the various countries were vying for supremacy. The masters of the art of war and famous generals of the Central Plains were innumerable. The outstanding ones were the three generals of the Great Feng dynasty, the twin annals who had almost succeeded in turning the tide before the Great Feng dynasty was destroyed, the 12 generals who hung portraits in the Qingyun Pavilion after the founding of the Dechu dynasty. The 9 kingdoms of the spring and autumn confronted each other for supremacy. The 100 schools of thought and the school of the military took advantage of the situation and flourished. In the early stages there was the war god Li Gonglin, who was known as Dechu's war god Han Yufu, who had led the cavalry into the desert several times. Then there were the 4 great generals of the spring and autumn period. The butcher Su Shao, West Chu soldier Yi Baikui, East Yu's prince consort Wang Sui and Gu Jiantang. Now there were people like Chao Chongqing Dong Zhuo's Lu Xingxiang, and the others who began to use hundreds of thousands of soldiers as chess pieces in their hands, leading the situation of the country while talking and laughing. Even young people like Zhong Tan, Xie Shibian and Ko Jianghuai were rising rapidly. Li Mixi raised his head and looked up. It was the moonlight of a high-rise building. The 2 lights were competing with each other. The old man suddenly laughed softly and said, "I heard that the king of the northern courtyard has never liked to pretend to be cultured. The only thing he collected was a copybook by Yuan Fengshen, the founding hero of the Great Feng dynasty. Yuan Fengshen, who was known as the Great Wall of the Frontier, by the founding emperor of the Feng Empire, died young. Compared to the generals of the same generation, his reputation was not prominent in history. Therefore his ranking was extremely low. Huang Sanjia, who was more ambitious than the sky, once said that Yuan Fengshen and the prince consort Wang Sui, who held the lifeline of the country in his hands when he was only 20 years old, were listed together as the destined martial artists who did not wait for me. Tuoba did not have any good or bad impression of Li Mixi. There was no need to fear him and there was no need to curry favor with him. In Beimang there were only a handful of people who could have Tuoba's mentality. The former king of the northern courtyard, Su Huainan, and the 2 successive kings of the southern courtyard, Huang Songpu and Dong Zhuo, could not do it. The old man, who had devoted half his life to Beimang's great cause, sighed with emotion. "I have never liked Jianghu. Probably has something to do with what I saw and heard when I was young and traveling to study." The 9 kingdoms of spring and autumn attracted Jianghu people within their jurisdiction. Dechu saw them as sparrows in a cage. Southern Tang saw them as Tang Qianyan. Later on, Liang also gave those Jianghu people a bag of embroidered carps. The meaning is clear. You are nothing but the carps in the pond of the Zhao family. The old man let go of the reins, rubbed his hands, exhaled and said with a smile, "All these years I have been like a fisherman, helping His Majesty look after the small pond in front of the court. It is no wonder that the people of Liyang are conceited and always say that there is no Jianghu in Beimang. It is because they have Li Chungang Wang Xinji Dong Tai Chao Chongqing, and now they have Su Fengyin leading a large group of rising stars. We indeed do not have any real Jianghu people in Beimang. 4 of the 5 major sects are all His Majesty's subordinates. You, the king of the northern courtyard, are a military general. Hong Jingyan is the Ruran lord. It was not easy for Huyan Grand Monastery and Luoyang to come out, but they all ran to Liyang. Even you, the Beimang god of war, had to make a special trip to Liyang before the great battle of Liangmang to take a look at Mount Hui. Toba was somewhat surprised. In his impression, Li Mibi had always been a person who believed that 100 words were not worth 100 words. When Tuoba entered the palace for the first time by virtue of his military exploits, he saw 2 gray-haired elders sitting on the steps outside the hall nibbling on dates. Su Huainan, who controlled half the country's military, was no stranger to him. When Tuoba was young, he was able to rise in the ranks of the Norland army and stand out among the nobles with the surnames of Murong and Yelu. Su Huainan's impartiality played a huge role in Tuoba's success. That time when he had an audience with His Majesty, he had spent most of his time patiently waiting outside the hall. The one who left the deepest impression on him was the old man who swallowed dates with Su Huainan. After seeing him, the old man's gaze was like a snake coiled in a dark corner, hissing. It was especially cold. From the beginning to the end, it was Su Huainan who was second only to one and above tens of thousands of people who exchanged pleasantries with Tuoba. The other old man, Old Snake, who rarely slipped out of the trenches to bask in the sun, was expressionless as he nibbled on dried dates. When Tuoba was summoned into the hall to meet the emperor, he still felt a chill run down his spine. Li Mibi probably did not know that he had once shocked the future Beimang god of war. He turned his head and smiled. When Hong Jia fled north at the end of the spring and autumn period, our Beimang reaped the benefits. However, many of the survivors thought that they were rootless duckweeds and only wanted to return to their homeland. Even if they could not do it while they were alive, they wanted their descendants to bring their ashes to the south. I, Li Mibi, am the same as Su Huainan. It's just that they wanted to return to their roots, but I have never had such thoughts. There is a plant in the medical books that can treat venomous insects and snakes. It's called the dandelion. After the seeds leave the branches and leaves, they will drift far away with the wind and take root as soon as they land. Wherever they land, that is where their hometown is. Although Tuoba had never been involved in the family affairs of the Beimang and was trusted and valued by the empress, Tuoba was not unaware of the movements of the Beimang and southern dynasties over the years. Bodhisattva Tuoba could roughly guess the meaning behind Li Mixi's words. In fact, for the past 20 years, the Norland had mostly used such tricks to suppress the Hua people in the southern dynasties. They were very familiar with making groundless accusations and slandering the Hua people. However, since Li Mibi was the ancestor of the Beimang spies, Tuoba had no choice but to take it seriously. Over the years, I've only done 2 things. On the surface, I've taken care of the fish pond, but in the dark, I've been sweeping the fallen leaves in the courtyard. The latter is like catching butterflies that have broken out of their cocoons in foreign lands and putting them into cages one by one. I've always enjoyed it, but unfortunately it hasn't been very effective. In the end, even His Majesty thinks that I'm making a fuss over nothing. Although he doesn't suspect that I'm raising bandits for his own sake, he's been losing interest in it over the past few years, especially after Su Huainan's death, which made His Majesty very sad. I know that His Majesty feels guilty and resentful about this matter. He feels guilty because he and his minister didn't end things well and let Su Huainan die an unnatural death. His resentment is directed at me because it was my vigilance and suspicion that gave the young man surnamed Su the opportunity to take away Su Huainan's head and bring shame to the entire Norland. However, I have a feeling that even if I have not found a single bamboo whip after 20 years of digging, there are definitely a few fish that have escaped the net with ulterior motives in the royal court and the southern court. They are hidden very deeply and are bitterly waiting for a certain opportunity. Tuoba frowned and said, since even you can't find them, even if there are a few fish that have escaped the net, it has been 20 years. How can they succeed? The old man relaxed his tone and smiled. I can't compare to the prefect of peace, nor can I compare to you, Tuoba or Dongjua. I am an outsider to both military and political matters, and I don't have any great foresight. However, doing the dirty work that seems to happen right under my nose all year round has developed a good habit of not too big nor too small. That is to first understand the people and matters that are close to me. Otherwise, I won't be able to sleep and eat in peace. I have focused all my attention on the great clans that rise and fall. I am not like many of you who are still fighting to the death with the Bailiang cavalry. You have already set your sights on the great and city further south, the Central Plains and the Guangling River. I have something that I have always wanted to ask but I can't. Today there is only the king of the northern court and me. Can you enlighten me? Tuoba said in a low voice. Sir, please ask. Li Mibi's tone was particularly stiff. Has no one other than me thought that Bailiang would win and Beimang would lose? Chapter 1476. After confirming that Wang Sui was the stabilizing force of Beimang's eastern front, Su Fengyan looked calm, but his heart was in turmoil. This news was too shocking, no less shocking than the news that Shangyin Academy's Qi Yanglong had entered the capital and become the Minister of Imperial Command. The Central Plains had sunk and countless heroes had been washed away by the waves. They had either been loyal to their country, fled from the world, or entered the Liang Temple with the bad reputation of being a slave of two surnames. Many others had concealed their names, living in the forests and the alleys of the city. Wang Mingyin, the world's 11th most famous general, Gu Dezhu, the crown prince of western Shu, Su Su and Lu Xiufu, who had fled to Beimang, and the only orphan of the Ji province's Han family, who had become a bandit in Beimang, were all like this. If Su Fengyan had not entered Jianghu and stirred up a storm, they might have remained like this, day after day, year after year, in small mud ponds, never to be seen by the world again. Wang Sui's comeback, his sudden appearance after 20 years of hibernation, was undoubtedly the most prominent, especially since he had chosen Beimang, which would inevitably have a huge and far-reaching impact on the world's situation. Because this distinguished and elegant prince consort of Dongyue, one of the 4 famous generals of the spring and autumn period, was the most superb at commanding troops, and was best at defeating powerful enemies with a small number of troops. He was the Qi in the Chuyu Qijing of the spring and autumn period, and truly stood shoulder to shoulder with the military master Yi Baikue. As a matter of fact, Su Shao, who had not been conferred the title of king at that time, was known for his invincible iron cavalry of the Su family. His personal deployment of troops and generals could not be mentioned in the same breath as Yi Baikue and Wang Sui. Regarding this, Su Shao had never concealed it in front of his children. Ren Tu, who rarely praised people of the same generation, had never concealed his admiration for Wang Sui. Even Li Yishan had said that if Yi Baikue, who considered himself the teacher of the king's way, was replaced by Wang Sui, who was good at sneak attacks, who liked to move troops on a large scale, who was good at maneuvering, and who never fought with his back against the wall, the Su family's troops and horses would not be able to complete the encirclement at the Battle of the Western Wall. It was a great misfortune that Wang Sui was in Beimang. Fortunately, Wang did not appear in Liangmang's battlefield, but was in the eastern front to contain Gu Jianghu's 300,000 Liao border army. There was also a son-in-law of the emperor's son-in-law, surnamed Wang, and a son-in-law of the emperor of emperors. Coincidentally, a son-in-law of Wang. There was a son-in-law of a certain city, surnamed Wang's. A son-in-law of A's. Wang Xinji and Wang Sui. One was a Jianghu grandmaster who never cared about the prosperity or decline of the imperial court. The other was a prince consort with real power who rested on a beauty's knee when he was sober. Seeing Su Fengyan fall into silence and become more and more serious, Jiang and I calmly said, "Back then when we were traveling in Beimang, Uncle Chao and I visited Wang Sui. Uncle Chao advised Wang Sui that he could work for Dechu, but he was rejected. Wang Sui said that Dongyue's loss to Liang was due to the general trend and not because of war. As for the destruction of Dongyue, there was no knot in his heart that couldn't be untied. However, losing to Gu Jianghu was his second greatest humiliation, after losing to Wang Xinji when he was young. He wanted to fight with Gu Jianghu again under the circumstances of equal military strength and power." Su Fengyan muttered to himself, "You're already in your 60s, how can you still be so childish? Military affairs are not child's play. You punched me today, so I'll kick you again tomorrow." Jiang and I had a strange expression. "Wang Sui mentioned you before. After he heard that you were practicing the saber, he made a bet with Uncle Chao. Wang Sui bet that you would definitely become a martial arts grandmaster in the future." Su Fengyan smiled and said, "What's there to bet on? Isn't it obvious that it's a done deal? Your uncle is also willing to place a bet." Isn't he just a spendthrift who is willing to spread wealth? What's the bet? Jiang and I said unhappily, Uncle Chao didn't say that you couldn't become a grandmaster. He only put your achievements at the same level as his own. However, Wang Sui said that you could fight with Wang Xianji. Su Fengnian touched his prickly stubble that hadn't been shaved for more than half a year. Wang Sui has a unique foresight. If there's a chance, I'll definitely treat this old fellow to a drink. Just based on his foresight, I'll toast him 3 big cups first. Jiang and I smiled for the first time. Do you know why Wang Sui thought so highly of you when you were just a first-tier Vajra realm martial artist? Su Fengnian couldn't guess what Wang Sui, a 1,000-year-old tortoise, was thinking. He casually replied, appearance. Jiang and I seemed to have suffered a heavy blow and was speechless. Su Fengnian was astonished. Wang Sui really judged people based on appearance? Jiang and I was in a bad mood and didn't want to talk anymore. Su Fengnian started to ponder on it. Wang Sui was born in a noble family. When he was young, he abandoned all restraints and was a chivalrous person. He only turned over a new leaf when he was 20 years old. He had only practiced martial arts for 5 years and was proficient in all kinds of martial arts. His swordsmanship was especially outstanding. Even sword pools Song Nianqing and Chai Qingshan had praises for him. When Wang Sui was young, he was also publicly recognized as a handsome man in Dongyue. Those ladies with outstanding backgrounds in the imperial court all liked to call him Sandalwood. In that case, he is a kindred spirit like me. No wonder, no wonder. Jiang and I couldn't help but want to kick. Su Fengnian had expected this and turned his head to glare. Probably because she was used to being bullied in her early years. Even though she was a female sword immortal who could travel thousands of miles in the wind, she still instinctively pulled her foot back. Su Fengnian was still angry. Who did you learn this from? Chao Chongqing or old Grand Preceptor Sun Shiji? Jiang Ni's face was cold as she muttered, why do you care? Su Fengnian rubbed his butt. That kick in the small alley not long ago had destroyed the air of an expert that he had worked so hard to cultivate. His face was suddenly filled with anger as he snorted strangely. I heard that there is a young pretty boy in your West Chu temple. His surname is Song and he is so famous that even in Great Peace City, it is said that his face is white, his appearance is beautiful, and he is as solemn as the wind under the pine trees, tall and gentle. Many people have nothing better to do and say that this guy often travels the mountains and rivers and is mistaken by the village woodcutter as an immortal who has come down to the mortal world. Even Qi Yanglong praised him in front of Zhao Xuan, saying that the one surnamed Song has outstanding literary talent. Among the young scholars in the world, his poems and essays are like the dragon in the dragon palace. Only this person has obtained a pearl, the rest are just the claws of a dragon. So now Li Yong has the saying of dragon and phoenix poise, which is to say this guy's literary talent, and Jiang and I pretended to be confused and interrupted Su Fengnian's chatter. I have heard of the dragon and phoenix poise. As for Song Maolin, he is the youngest Hanlin scholar in the history of Dechu. If it wasn't for Uncle Chao, he would also be the youngest chessman waiting for the imperial decree. But as for dragon and phoenix poise, Northern Su and Southern Song, or Song Maolin's essays reflecting the beauty of so-and-so, I don't know anything about them. Su Fengnian laughed angrily. That pretty boy dares to be ranked with me? I can take down 1,000 Song Maolins with one hand. Didn't he just write a careless declaration? I think it's just that. Immortal my ass. Jiang and I still had that innocent look in her eyes. So it's like this. If I remember correctly, Grand Preceptor Sun once praised him for writing a declaration that was equivalent to 100,000 soldiers. Then she lowered her head and started counting with her fingers. Li Yang's secretary Qi Yanglong said that his literary talent is good, and he has the style of an immortal. Tantanon said that this person's imperial examination writing skills are not inferior to Sun Yin's. The Imperial College's Left Chancellor Yao Baifeng said that he is knowledgeable and reasonable. In addition, our Dechu's Grand Preceptor Sun said that his declaration writing is imposing. Uncle Chao said that his chess skills are only slightly inferior to Fan Zhongho's. Out of the 10 most knowledgeable people in the world, 5 of them said good things about him. Let me count again, there seems to be. Su Fengnian rolled her eyes. Stop, stop. That pretty boy only has a little bit of fame in the scholarly world. Look at your so-called so-and-so again. Jiang and I deliberately looked left and right, but she didn't look at Su Fengnian. Who is it? Where is it? Why can't I see it? Su Fengyan stretched out his hand and gently pressed Jiang Ni's forehead, not allowing her to shake her head. Jiang and I slapped his hand away and said disdainfully, "Are you bored? Why are you concerned about a scholar from Guangling who is far away on the horizon? Beimang's million-strong army is pressing on Beiliang's border. Can you take care of them all?" Chapter 1477. Su Fengyan looked into Jiang Ni's eyes and asked softly, "It is said that most of the civil officials in the West Chu imperial court have suggested Song Maolin and you." Jiang and I once again interrupted Su Fengyan's words. Her expression was normal and her tone was calm as if she was talking about a small matter that had nothing to do with her. Previously there was someone who suggested Ko Zhonghuai followed by Xie Shibian and then Song Maolin. Su Fengyan's face was gloomy. He asked in a deep voice, "What is Chao Chongqing doing? If he is too busy to take care of you, Princess de Chu, then I didn't see him fight all the way to Great Peace City. If he is very free, then can't he control a few mouths in the imperial court? How can he restore his country like this?" Jiang and I shook her head and said, "Uncle Chao is already very good." Su Fengyan wanted to say something but stopped. Jiang and I gently exhaled and looked at the dim street in the distance. "What do you say? Should we take the initiative to fight or wait for them to come to us?" Su Fengyan instantly returned to his sloppy self. "It wasn't easy for me to accumulate such an imposing aura, but you kicked it away. Then let's wait. Snow Lotus City is neither big nor small. We still have about 2 hours." Jiang and I asked doubtfully, "Don't leave? Anyway, we have been running all the way. We don't care about this time, right?" Su Fengyan did not say anything. He turned and walked back into the alley. Jiang and I silently followed behind him. Ma Jiabao's daughter Ma Shigong and the poor youth Hong Shuji were still there. The swordsman from the Central Plains also did not leave. Obviously he had not given up on the Snow Lotus. Seeing the sword Immortal Senior, and the beautiful woman with the box on her back return with complicated expressions, the middle-aged man knew that the two immortals were also here for the Snow Lotus. He would not be able to snatch it from them. Even if he begged, he would not be able to get it. However, when he thought of the woman who had to rely on Liaodong ginseng to survive every month, the man gritted his teeth and cupped his fists to Su Fengyan. "Senior, can you give me the Snow Lotus? Junior Xiao Mu is willing to exchange his life for it." Su Fengyan was stunned for a moment before he shook his head and said, "I must have this Snow Lotus. There's nothing to discuss." Xiao Mu's expression was sorrowful. After closing his eyes, he suddenly opened them and said resolutely, "Then I can only ask Senior for advice." Su Fengyan waved his hand and smiled, "Why don't you wait for a night? If I'm still in the city at dawn, you can exchange your life for the Snow Lotus in Lu Huaishi's mansion. If I'm already out of the city, you can do business with that kid again. You're just helping him go to Ma Family Fort. With your strength as a level 2 master, it shouldn't be difficult for you to take over a private fort." A young girl with a strange name plucked up her courage and retorted, "Our Ma Family Fort's guard instructor is known as Iron Spear Wei in the martial world. He has a reed leaf spear made of refined iron and is 12 feet long. Just the tip of the spear is 1 foot and 3 inches long. It is very powerful. I once saw Instructor Wei pierce through 3 iron armors with his spear. Besides, our Ma Family Fort also has a cavalry army that comes and goes like the wind. Even General Lu's mansion in Snow Lotus City doesn't dare to underestimate our Ma Family Fort." Xiao Mu laughed it off. On the other hand, Su Fengyan squatted on the stairs beside Xiao Mu and said with a smile, "It sounds like your family is very strong. Let me ask you a question. Are your ancestors local or migrated from the Central Plains?" The young girl carefully said, "Why are you asking this?" Su Fengyan saw that she didn't want to answer, so he didn't ask anymore. He began to concentrate and rest. Xiao Mu hesitated for a long time and finally couldn't help but ask curiously, "Senior, do you really want to compete with Tuoba Bodhisattva of Beimang?" Su Fengyan nodded. Even Xiao Mu, who was used to seeing all kinds of storms, was speechless. Since he was able to fight with Beimang's military god, he should at least be a level 1 mysterious finger. He might even be able to touch the legendary threshold of celestial state, right? Jiang and I didn't want to see this guy pretending to be profound, so he snorted and said, "Has the fight been going on for more than half a month? The winner hasn't been decided yet." Xiao Mu's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. He swallowed his saliva. Su Fengyan smiled and didn't say anything. Although Xiaomu had stayed in Snow Lotus City, which was far away from the Central Plains, he couldn't figure out who had such a great ability. Was he blind? Was the senior sitting beside him the Peach Blossom Sword God Dong Tai? Otherwise, among the experts who used the sword, Song Yanqing of the Sword Pool and the #1 swordsman in the southeast Chai Qingshan, were both old men. Tongxi sword goddess Lu Baijie didn't have such ability. Their ages didn't match. While Xiaomu was rushing to Snow Lotus City from the Central Plains, he heard that Wu Luding, the sword crown of the Wu family's sword tomb, was traveling with a female sword servant. The old man who died under the sword of the senior also guessed the same and mentioned the sword nurturing and the flying sword. However, Xiaomu didn't think that Wu Luding could reach the level of fighting with Tuoba Bodhisattva for more than half a month in just a few years. No matter how amazing a martial arts genius was, it wasn't difficult for him to reach the first level without many life-threatening battles and the feeding of many top grandmasters. However, it was still difficult for him to reach the level of one of the top 10 martial artists. An hour later, the girl was sleepy and the boy forced his eyelids open. Su Fengyan raised his arm and the 6-year phoenix fell from the night sky. Su Fengyan took out the secret letter in the slender bamboo tube and felt relieved. Jiang and I looked at him inquiringly. Su Fengyan said happily, Su Yanbing left everyone behind and killed his way to Snow Lotus City alone. He can enter the city in an hour at most. Jiang and I said, then I'll wait for an hour. Su Fengyan shook his head and said, no need. Since Su Yanbing arrived earlier than I expected, you can return to Guangling Road without worry. Then Su Fengyan turned his head and said to the boy and Xiaomu, Hong Shuji, go and get that snow lotus. I'll help you fulfill your wish. Xiaomu, I'll be able to get Lu Huaishi's snow lotus for you by tomorrow morning at the latest. Remember to rush to Bailiang immediately after you deliver the snow lotus. You can protect your name in any of the relay stations in Yuzhou or Lingzhou. Someone will bring you to me when the time comes. In short, I'll take your life. The boy was half excited and half nervous. He blushed and asked, really? Su Fengyan gently waved his arm and made the gerfalcon return to the night sky. He nodded and said, you've seen how good my swordsmanship is with your own eyes. The boy jumped up and down happily. He hurriedly went into the house and took out an iron box. The box was filled with ice and the snow lotus was wrapped in ice. Su Fengyan took the box and handed it to the puzzled Jiang and I. This is for you. Su Fengyan pointed at the wound on her neck and then at his cheek. He said with a smile, Snow lotus is probably the best thing for a girl to maintain her beauty. Without giving Jiang and I a chance to refuse, Su Fengyan looked at her and said calmly, also, pass a message to Chao Chongqing. Tell him not to worry. There are some places that the Bailiang cavalry are familiar with. Su Fengyan blinked. If you don't mind passing a message for me, please tell that pretty boy surnamed Song that I'll beat him up until his parents can't recognize him. Jiang and I hugged the box and didn't say anything. Su Fengyan said with a smile, it's only an hour. I actually need to fight Tuoba Bodhisattva and Li Mibi alone. I want Tuoba Bodhisattva's state of mind to be completely damaged so that I'll have a better chance of winning the next time we fight. Don't worry. Once the situation turns bad, it'll be easy for me to run away. I've been recuperating all this time. It's enough for me to play cat and mouse with them for an hour. Jiang and I was still silent. Su Fengyan joked, what, you don't want to leave? Jiang and I spat. Su Fengyan waved his hand. Go go. Jiang Ni's expression was stiff and cold. She turned around and the great Liang dragon sparrow flew out of the red sandalwood sword box and floated in front of her. She gently jumped on it and disappeared like a rainbow in an instant. Xiaomu was dumbfounded once again. Another goddamn sword immortal. When did the streets of Liang become so full of sword immortals? The young man grinned at the girl. I told you she's really a fairy sister. The girl stepped on the back of the young man's foot. The young man stood on one leg and bared his teeth. About half an hour later, the girl looked at the man standing on the steps and looking in the direction where the fairy disappeared. She asked softly, you lied to her, didn't you? Su Fengyan smiled and turned to Xiaomu. Take the 2 children to the Snow Lotus parlor and tell them that I promised to give you a stalk of Snow Lotus. Madame Song will help you ask Lu Huaishi for it at all costs. Then let the Snow Lotus parlor settle them down. Let's go through the back door. When Xiaomu left with the boy and girl, they vaguely heard the sound of horse hooves coming from a distant alley. Chapter 1478. After the two of them entered the alley, their horses slowed down. The lights in the city dimmed, making the moonlight even more intense. Li Mibi chuckled softly and said, "That guy surnamed Su." Finally realized that it was the woman's dense sword chi that revealed their tracks, which made her leave Snow Lotus City first. "Within 100 miles, even if the Great Liang Dragon Sparrow is hidden in the box, I can still vaguely see it as a flickering firefly 10 feet away. However, it can be seen that although West Chu's Jiang Ni is a sword embryo that appears once in 100 years, it is still far from reaching the legendary realm of the world's ruler. Without Jiang Ni holding the line, that young man has no chance of winning. The key is to see if God will give him the luck to escape again." Along the way they had the absolute initiative. Now that the battle of life and death was imminent, Su Fengyan unexpectedly made a stupid move and broke his own wings. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva's expression did not seem relaxed. It shouldn't be that simple. In these years of life and death battles, Su Fengyan, Yang Taisui, Han Xingxian, Wang Xinji, Huang Qing and the Bronze Man ancestor were all in the position to win. However, the one who survived in the end was Su Fengyan. This is not something that can be explained by luck. Speaking of this, Tuoba Bodhisattva laughed. "If it wasn't for Mr.'s timely arrival, I would be no exception and become another stepping stone for Su Fengyan. For tonight's battle, Mr. might as well hide in the dark. I have almost recovered and can fight head-on with Su Fengyan. Whether Su Fengyan and Jiang and I have some tricks up their sleeves, or he admits that he has no way out and only wants to die with me, Mr. will be able to deal with it calmly." Li Mixi thought for a while and nodded. Without hesitation, his figure flashed on the horse's back. In the eyes of this ancestor of spies who had been entrenched in the center of Beimang's spiderweb for many years, if he had not interfered in the battle between Su Fengyan and Tuoba Bodhisattva, in terms of life and death, Su Fengyan would have won. However, in terms of victory and defeat, Tuoba Bodhisattva was still slightly better. Therefore, Tuoba Bodhisattva did not have any knot in his heart regarding his attack. That perfect and flawless state of mind also did not have any cracks. Li Mibi himself was the #1 Xian finger Xian after the death of Han Xingxian in Liang. He knew better than anyone the principle that it was difficult to repair a broken state of mind. Not everyone could recover to the peak after the state of mind fell like Li Chungang. If your state of mind is not damaged in the slightest, you won't be able to recover in 100 years. Moreover, Su Fengyan's injuries were far more serious than Tuoba Bodhisattva's. It could be assumed that the speed of his recovery and the recovery of his body was much slower than Tuoba Bodhisattva's. In the Battle of Snow Lotus City, Li Mibi really could not find a reason why Su Fengyan could win by luck. However, if Su Fengyan insisted on avoiding the battle and escaping, Li Mibi was not conceited enough to think that he could kill Su Fengyan. If one did not enter the first class or even the first-class Vajra realm, one would forever be a frog at the bottom of the well, unable to see the spectacular scenery outside the well. Only when a martial artist successfully entered the Xian finger realm and could perceive the circulation of the world, could he be considered a person above the well and move with the flow, like a fish swimming in the vast net of law. As for the celestial state and the more unfettered earth immortals, they could even sit on the ground and bargain with God. Li Mibi felt a little regretful. Because he was the shadow prime minister of Beimang, he had done too many things in his life that might have gone according to his wishes but definitely went against the world's rules. He did not dare to enter the celestial state because he was afraid that when the time came he would be caught in a trap of his own making. Li Mibi believed that Han Xingxian had never really crossed the threshold of celestial state in his life because he had this layer of concern. Li Mibi believed that there was God's will in the unseen world. If one was too selfish, it would certainly not be tolerated by the way of heaven. Li Mibi appeared and disappeared mysteriously and came to the corner of the cornice of a tall building. The back of the cornice under his feet was not carved with common spirit beasts such as Kailan, which could ward off evil spirits and pray for blessings. Instead, it was a lively carp with a lively posture. It was probably due to the unique water affinity of the buildings in the central plains. A wind chime was tied to a rope under the eaves, moving with the wind, melodious and light. The distance between here and the small house in the alley was only a straight-line distance of 500 steps. Looking down from the high ground, Li Mibi could have a clear view of the situation there. The battle that did not alarm Snow Lotus City was about to break out. In addition to paying attention to the peak battle between the two sides who were both great masters, Li Mibi had been paying attention to the direction where Jiang Ni flew away on his sword. Li Mibi suddenly laughed out loud and sighed with emotion. It was an unprecedented big year in Jianghu. There were as many experts as there were clouds. Even if many of the older generation died, the younger generation emerged faster. It was undoubtedly the grandest occasion in 1,000 years. The 14 people in the martial arts competition, including the 4 great masters and the top 10 experts, were all great celestial phenomenon or even earth immortals without exception. Not to mention Zhang and I, who could fly 1,000 miles on his sword. Shenyuan Qingfeng, who was already in the celestial phenomenon realm, would definitely be among the top 10 experts in Jianghu in the past. However, he was unfortunate to encounter such an era. If the white-robed monk Qi Beware and other hidden experts were added, Shenyuan Qingfeng might not even have a place in the top 20. In addition to these grandmasters and grandmasters who were already well known to the public, there was also the #1 beauty under the heavens, who had followed after the devil Woyang in the northern Mang territory, the unfathomable young Wudong sect leader Li Yufu, Jiang Fuding, who stood at the top of the martial emperor city in the eastern sea, Zhao Ningxian, who had walked down the mountain from the celestial master manor, Xianxia, who had traveled among the common people, Tomb Sword Crown Wu Luding, and that female sword attendant, and even Su Fingyan's 3 disciples were gradually showing their talents. If the world's experts could choose 2 people to fight, the battle between the military god of Beimang and the king of Bailiang in front of Li Mibi was probably only comparable to the battle between the Confucian Saint Chao Chongqing and the sword immortal Dong Tai. For some reason, Li Mibi bent over and sat cross-legged, no longer paying attention to the movement in the alley. He closed his eyes and let the cool breeze caress his face. The old man with a head full of frost and snow took out a dry biscuit from his bosom and chewed leisurely. Listening to the sound of the wind chimes close by, the old man shook his head as if he was enjoying it. After finishing the biscuit and wiping his mouth, the old man slowly got up and looked up at the night sky with the moon and sparse stars. He laughed heartily and said, "Hum hum hum hum. This world and this scene, the danger is great." In the alley far away, he welcomed Tuoba Bodhisattva with a clean and vigorous saber. Thunder rises in silence, moonlight rises on the flat ground. Tuoba Bodhisattva leaped high from the horse's back. Almost at the same time, Su Fingyan chopped the tall horse that was jogging in the alley into 2 halves with his saber. After passing through the horse's corpse, he tapped the wall with the tip of his foot and swung his saber at Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was more than 10 feet above the ground. It was unclear whether it was the light of the saber or the moonlight, but the sky above the secluded alley was covered in white. Tuoba Bodhisattva clenched his fists and made a hammering posture towards the bright light of the saber. Su Fingyan held the old-style Bailiang saber with both hands and did not resist the hammering. Instead, he turned around with his saber and spun in a big circle. In an instant, the 2 of them changed positions and came to Su Fingyan, who was higher behind Tuoba Bodhisattva. He slashed his saber at Tuoba Bodhisattva's back. Tuoba Bodhisattva's chi was heavy and his falling speed was much faster than the light of the saber. After his feet touched the ground, the king of the northern courtyard, who was still in a squatting position, knocked his separated fists on the ground and turned his body. When the momentum of the saber weakened a little, he faced it head-on. With his back facing the ground, he kicked like a whip towards Su Fingyan, who was still unwilling to stop his saber and changed to a new stance. Tuoba Bodhisattva loosened his grip on the saber and placed his hand on the back of the saber. With a slight twist, the saber turned sideways and collided with Tuoba Bodhisattva's whip kick. Instantly, the sound of metal colliding with stone was heard, like the chime of a huge bell. Su Fingyan and Tuoba Bodhisattva fell to the ground at the same time like 2 meteors. Coincidentally, one of them stood at the end of the alley and the other landed at the end. They rushed forward at the same time. While running, Su Fingyan did not look dispirited at all. Instead, he was high-spirited and full of vigor. He did not have the exhaustion of an arrow at the end of its flight when Zhang and I was beside him. It was even harder to believe that this guy would stagger and need to lean against the wall to walk. When the 2 of them were 10 steps apart, Su Fingyan twisted his body and spun his saber with him. In a short period of time, the slash was filled with vigor. Even Tuoba Bodhisattva did not face this attack head-on. With his back against the wall, his footsteps did not stop. When he brushed past Su Fingyan, he pushed out his palm and pushed it towards Su Fingyan's temple. Su Fingyan lowered his head and bent his waist. He spun on the spot and slashed his saber across his waist. Tuoba Bodhisattva, who had missed his punch, did not continue to tangle with him. He continued to rush forward and still did not face the attack head-on. Su Fengyan chased after him. He slightly increased the strength of his left leg and rushed diagonally to the wall. He stretched out his leg and stepped on the wall of the alley. In the next moment his body crashed into the wall on the other side. This repeated repeatedly as he chased after Tuoba Bodhisattva. He and Tuoba Bodhisattva started a silent battle in this unknown alley. From the moment the two of them collided after landing on the ground, Su Fengyan's two sabers did not leave any marks on the floor or walls of the alley. Tuoba Bodhisattva's punch also did not leave a hole on the wall. There was not even a finger-sized hole. What happened next was still an unusual and strange situation. It was a narrow alley that only allowed two people to ride side by side. Although Su Fengyan was moving with his saber, he did not release any saber light. Only when the moonlight shone on his cold saber did it reflect a white light. It was obvious that Tuoba Bodhisattva was able to attack less and defend more than attack. However, Su Fengyan did not have the self-destructive aura that he had when he was in a life-and-death battle. Both of them attacked quickly and stopped even faster. They were as fast as lightning and thunder. There was nothing else that could be shown. This kind of subtle battle could not even be compared to the battle between two second-grade masters from Xianxia County. The two great masters who were qualified to not talk about etiquette with the King of Heaven and Earth were polite and restrained in this alley. They did not overstep the rules and did not cross the line at all. They were like gentlemen. Chapter 1479. There was no majesty that could uproot mountains and rivers. There was no unbridled joy. There was only a little restraint. Instead, it was like a woman's embroidery with only the slightest struggle. But once it succeeded, there might be one less great guru in the world. Both of them tacitly drew a circle around the ground. The alley was a cage. A fight in a cage. Both of them only wanted to stab each other in the mirror of the state of mind. Among the four great gurus in the world, other than the two who were fighting, Cao Chongqing used the way of the king to enter the way of the overbearing. It was clearly the way of the death. The four chairs placed at the top of martial arts, Cao Chongqing had stood up and left his seat. Then only Dong Tai, the champion of the way of the sword, was left. The winner of tonight's fight would not only determine their life and death, but could also seize the opponent's state to a large extent. In the future, when he fought with Dong Tai, he would undoubtedly have the upper hand. Therefore, it could be said that tonight's fight could almost determine who would be the undisputed number one in the world in the future. At this moment, both of them tilted their heads. Tuoba Bodhisattva's fist seemed to be resting on his left shoulder. Su Fengyan's cold blade also seemed to be lifted by Tuoba Bodhisattva's shoulder. Su Fengyan's hair did not move. The cold blade in his hand seemed to have touched the tip of the wall, but in fact, it did not pierce the wall at all. In the next moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva's knee hit Su Fengyan's abdomen. Su Fengyan also punched Tuoba Bodhisattva's chest. Both of them collided backward. Their feet slid out on the bluestone floor. Tuoba Bodhisattva pressed down with his right hand. The moment his back was about to touch the wall, he stopped moving backward. Su Fengyan shook his wrist holding the blade. Similarly, he did not touch the wall. Tuoba Bodhisattva waved his hand and hit Su Fengyan's side. Su Fengyan hit Tuoba Bodhisattva's face with his blade at the same time. After both of them fell out, they stood still. Su Fengyan twitched the corner of his mouth. Tuoba Bodhisattva was expressionless, but the mark on his face was clearly visible. Li Mixi wanted him dead. Tuoba Bodhisattva wanted him to lose and then die. Just as the girl had guessed based on her intuition, Su Fengyan was lying. At that time, the report he received from Lu Nianfeng was not the good news that Su Yanbing would quickly arrive. Instead, when the imperial edict allowing 10,000 Shu soldiers to leave the borders of western Shu, Beiliang had already confirmed that Chen Zhibao and Xia Guanying had quietly appeared among the Qingzhou navy. This was a secret intelligence report from Xu Xiu, who was traveling with King of Jing and Zhao Sun. This meant that even before Chen Zhibao led the Shu troops into the battlefield, he could have a direct impact on the Guangling River battle. At this time, with or without Jiang Anai in the army, the situation of the entire West Chu would be completely different. Other than the time when Su Fengyan woke up and fled, he had been lying to her. With the Buddha bowl given by the chicken soup monk, Su Fengyan's recovery speed was not slower than Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was lighter. Instead, it was faster. Without this secret intelligence, Su Fengyan would continue to lie, pretending that he was half dead, pretending that he needed her to carry him all the way to escape, pretending that without her he would not be able to withstand Tuoba Bodhisattva and Li Mixi's pursuit for even a moment. And the little mud man, who was never smart, was indeed kept in the dark. She did not ask why he could escape from the pursuit every time, why he could see through Li Mixi's killing moves at just the right time, and why he could give pointers from the side. Moreover, every time he commented on the gains and losses after the battle, he could make her advance by leaps and bounds in the way of the sword with just a few words. He originally wanted to have a fair fight with Tuoba Bodhisattva in Xianxia City. In addition to letting her watch and benefit from the battle, it was more like fulfilling the wish of his youth and proving one thing to her. What? You said that I only know how to bully you? How is that possible? As long as I really want to practice martial arts, not to mention the top 10 masters, even if Wang Xinji did not dare to call herself the #1 in the world, it would be a piece of cake. At that time, when they parted outside the city, he could give her the snow lotus and boast shamelessly, "This is a reward from the #1 master in the world." On the tall building in the distance, Li Mixi's mood gradually became serious from the beginning of his leisure. He looked at the sky. It was almost dawn. After a full 6 hours, the two people in the alley still could not decide who was the winner. It was not that Li Mixi did not want to interfere or loot a burning house. Even if he angered the king of the northern courtyard, as long as Li Mixi could kill Su Fengyan, he did not care what Tuoba Bodhisattva thought. However, Li Mixi left the tall building and approached the alley several times, but he did not find any flaws. After repeated this several times without success, Li Mixi had to stand on the roof patiently. Several times he looked at a place dozens of miles away from the city and became more worried. At first he could catch the sword chi within 300 miles, but after half a day he could only shorten it to 200 miles. Before he reached Xianxia City, it was only 100 miles. Now it was only 50 miles, but it had become vague. It seemed that it would not be long before a female sword fairy appeared in the world. Li Mixi continued to wait. When the sky was slightly brighter, the world gradually turned blue and white. Li Mixi sighed regretfully and flew down the building, landing at the end of the alley. Su Fengyan and Tuoba Bodhisattva had just pulled apart the distance between them again. Su Fengyan knelt on one knee, his cold blade drawing a long groove on the ground in front of him. Tuoba Bodhisattva did not feel good either. He sat on the ground, panting heavily for the first time. Li Mixi stood not far away from Tuoba Bodhisattva and did not speak. Tuoba Bodhisattva sighed softly and stood up. He said calmly, "It's meaningless, let's go." Li Mixi nodded. If he continued to waste time, when Su Yanbing arrived, he would be caught like a turtle in a jar. Before Tuoba Bodhisattva turned around, he looked at the young man who had also stood up and said with a smile, "Even if the Bailiang cavalry is completely wiped out, no matter how exhausted you are, as long as you, Su Fengyan, say the word, I will fight you alone." Su Fengyan stood with his blade in hand, silent. Chapter 1480. When Tuoba Bodhisattva and Li Mibi returned to the north, there was also a purple rainbow outside the city that headed east. After the battle, the cold blade in Su Fengyan's hand could not bear the burden and broke into two. He bent down to pick up the broken blade and put it back into the scabbard first. After traveling 30 miles north of Snow Lotus City, the two turned west. Li Mibi finally spoke and shook his head with a smile. "The king of Bailiang is young, but he is very scheming." Tuoba Bodhisattva suddenly asked, "Sir, do you know why you did not fight to the death last night and only competed with him in the state of mind?" Li Mibi thought about it but still could not figure it out. Or rather, he was unwilling to believe the truth. Tuoba Bodhisattva smiled. Using fate energy to transform into a cultivation base that has nothing to do with the state, Su Fengyan, who is in a treasure mountain, can squander it at any time. However, he still has a sense of propriety and only managed to ensure that he does not die. Su Fengyan's first strike in the alley was to tell me this fact, to tell us not to push him too far. If it was just a competition of chi, Su Fengyan would not have lost. Between you and me, one of us might have been left behind. It's just that he probably wants to leave more resources for his crumbling northern Liang. Li Mibi sighed. Fate energy, Bailiang's fate energy. Tuoba Bodhisattva said in a low voice, "I will not go to Liuzhou first. I will go back to the southern court with you to remind His Majesty and the imperial decree of peace." Li Mibi suddenly got angry and sneered, "You always say that Baimang's Jianghu is not a real Jianghu. Then Su Fengyan, who is second to none as a great guru in Liang, is not even cool in a fight. When has he ever done anything cool? Chao Chongqing, Gu Jiantang and the rest are the same. Only Dong Tai is worthy of his name. Tuoba Bodhisattva's expression did not change. He reached out to wipe the blood from his nose and said indifferently, "A pitiful person has his own detestable side, a laughable person has his own respectable side. Therefore I hope that Su Fingyan will die in my hands and not under the hooves of the Sword Emperor of West Shu." In Snow Lotus City, a young man carrying a saber stood in front of a small shop that sold meat naan with a worried expression. The shopkeeper waited for a long time, but didn't see this fellow take out his money pouch. He rolled his eyes and after a long time he stopped paying attention to this poor bastard. "What's wrong? I'm a man, not one of those young and foolish girls or ferocious women. Do you think you can eat for free just because you look like a dog? Just because he had a saber on his waist he was considered a master of chivalry? Who are you trying to scare?" Not long after, his wife and daughter, who came to the shop to help, glanced at the young man shyly, which gave the man a headache and a toothache. He wanted to give the young man the smallest meat naan so that he could get out of the shop, but his shameless wife had already given his daughter 2 pieces of meat naan with the most weight. Then his daughter shamelessly shook her waist and stood in front of the young bastard. She timidly handed the meat naan to him and said with a smile that she would not take his copper coins. The man fiercely turned his head away. "Out of sight, out of mind. Motherf *Ker, I was much more handsome than you when I was young, okay?" Just when the young man reached out to take the meat naan with a bright smile, an angry voice sounded beside him, "Do you have any shame?" Then she stared at the young girl. "How much is it?" The young girl was stunned and replied, "1 meat naan is 6 copper coins, 2 are 5 copper coins." She turned around with her back to the young man and carefully took out about 7 or 8 auspicious talismans from a beautiful money pouch. Most of them were small coins of 1 copper coin, and there were 2 of them with a discount of 2 copper coins. There weren't many big coins. Talismans issued during the auspicious talisman era were all new money, and they had nothing to do with the famous spring water from the previous dynasty. She muttered to herself, but in the end she was really reluctant to hand over the 5 small coins of 1 copper coin. And she was also reluctant to take out the copper coin with a face value of 10 copper coins because she only had these 2 coins in her money pouch. They came in pairs and it was not good to separate them. In the end she could only frown and give the young girl 1 small coin of 1 copper coin and 2 coins with a discount of 2 copper coins. It was exactly 5 copper coins to buy 2 meat naans. The conflicted expression on her face was as if she was watching her daughter get married. The young girl and the woman in the shop didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was only 5 copper coins, why was she so reluctant to part with them? The young man stopped her and said softly with a smile, Okay, you don't need to spend money. Take it." The young man with a sword turned his head and looked into the distance. He waved his hand and soon, a tall and sturdy man with a respectful expression ran over. The young man asked, "Do you have any silver coins?" The man was also one of the top experts in Snow Lotus City, but he still nodded his head in fear when facing this young man. He took out all the silver coins he had on him and he was so respectful that he even wanted to give up his life. The young man only asked for 1 silver coin and gave it to the young girl. He took the meat naan and said with a smile, "Keep the change." The young girl, whose heart was swayed by the smile, said sweetly, "Thank you, young master." The young girl beside him turned her head and put the copper coins back. Her lips moved slightly and her face was full of disdain. Judging from the shape of her lips, she should be saying the words, "Thank you, young master." The young man smiled and gave her a freshly baked and fragrant meat naan. Then he said, "I won't see you off. Remember not to leave the city on your sword. It's very scary in broad daylight." The young girl, who was carrying a purple box, took the meat naan and walked straight to the city gate. He waited until her figure slowly disappeared from his sight, and then he walked away with his back to her. The tall and sturdy man, who was Madame Song's personal retainer in the Snow Lotus house, kept his head down and didn't dare to look at them. He lowered his head and bit the meat naan. The meat naan was covered with scarlet blood. In the distance, above the clouds which were as high as the 9th heaven, a woman with fluttering clothes stood on the great Liang dragon sparrow and flew with the wind. Her whole body was bathed in golden light. She held a copper coin above her head and looked at it in a daze. She knew that he lied to her. She suddenly felt a little annoyed. She suddenly flew up on her sword and said angrily, "I should have found some copper coins." Chapter 1481. There were many brothels in Snow Lotus City and they were clustered together. The tall buildings stretched as far as the eye could see, and the layers upon layers of overhanging eaves actually gave off a grandeur similar to that of an imperial palace. The Snow Lotus building was the one with the tallest eaves, and it had 8 floors. The name of the sleepless city also came from this. It was dawn, but the wide main street was not deserted. There were constantly rich men in disheveled clothes walking out of the brothels with enchanting women snuggling up to them. If they met their brother-in-law on the bed on the street, the men would look at each other and smile. Everything would be understood without words. Su Fengnian let the man of sacrifice from the whisk room lead the way. When he walked on the street full of the strong fragrance of cosmetics, there were many brothel girls who were tired and should have gone back to the building to catch up on sleep. They threw flirtatious glances at Su Fengnian. Some of the bolder girls even tried to seduce this handsome guy with a strange face. The street was very long. Su Fengnian walked forward with his saber hanging on his waist. Amidst the surprised cries, shouts and laughter, there were many women who had just climbed into their beds but had not yet fallen asleep. Following the sounds and movements, they opened their windows and leaned against the railings, smiling as they watched this distinguished and elegant young master. Someone started shouting, "Young master, your servant will pay you 20 taels of silver. Do you want to come?" Very soon there were people offering 30 taels of silver. The second-class spy from the whisk room, who was the only one other than Mrs. Song in the Snow Lotus building who knew about Su Fengnian's identity, broke out in a cold sweat. At the same time he also had a heroic spirit. He thought that if the northern barbarians had a young empress, then Liang Mang wouldn't have to fight anymore. Su Fengnian dodged the messy things like fruits, silk scarves and undergarments. He felt a little helpless. Only then did he remember that he hadn't been to a brothel since he parted with the girl who held the white cat, Wu Mainyang. Earlier when he was hanging out with Li Han Lin Yan and the other martial arts addicts, he often saw this scene. However, at that time the brothels in Liangzhou and Lingzhou all knew about his background. They were more interested in his Royal Highness title and the money in their pockets. Unlike other brothels, the Snow Lotus building was located on both sides of the street. It occupied the end of the street and stood out like a crane among chickens. It was like a king facing the north and facing the south. The unusual noise on the street also alarmed the Snow Lotus building. Therefore, when Su Fengnian walked out of the building, there were curious girls on the 6th floor and below sticking their heads out of the windows. However, the rules of the Snow Lotus building were strict. They didn't dare to join in the fun like their peers. Especially when they saw the burly man standing at the bottom of the stairs in a respectful manner, they didn't dare to act rashly. Su Fengnian didn't care about this harmless episode. Tuoba Bodhisattva of the 4 great grandmasters had already confirmed his return to the north. Dong Tai had never been an enemy. Chao Chongqing was in Guangling Road. Who in the world could assassinate him? Who would dare? Madame Song didn't go downstairs to welcome him with great fanfare. Obviously she was being cautious. Su Fengnian went straight to the top floor. Madame Song and the new courtesan of the Snow Lotus building, Yu Qingling, whom he had met not long ago, stood at the door of an elegant room. Madame Song pushed the door open. Su Fengnian stepped over the threshold and entered the quaint room. Madame Song and Yu Qingling quietly followed behind. The burly man quickly closed the door and stood outside the room like a door god. After Su Fengnian found a chair and sat down, Yu Qingling began to brew tea without Madame Song's instruction. The tea set on the table had already been prepared. Su Fengnian signaled Madame Song to sit down with him. She gently asked if he wanted to eat breakfast. Su Fengnian shook his head and asked, "Have you settled Xiao Mu and the 2 children?" Madame Song reported, "Everything has been settled. According to the order, the forces in the Snow Lotus building have begun to operate. They will be able to seize the Snow Lotus in Lu Huaishi's residence by tonight at the latest." Yu Qingling's smooth movements of brewing tea suddenly became sluggish. Madame Song's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed in an instant. Su Fengnian waved his hand and said, "Cancel the mission. There's no need for it." Madame Song nodded and didn't show any doubt. Su Fengnian said softly, "I'll rest in the Snow Lotus building for a day. You can carry on as usual. You don't have to spend time entertaining me." Madame Song wanted to say something but hesitated. Without waiting for Su Fengnian to speak, she immediately dismissed the idea and said with a guilty expression, "I've overstepped." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "There's nothing to hide." I just fought with Tuoba Bodhisattva who chased me all the way to Snow Lotus City. We still couldn't determine the winner. I reckon Li Mibi is beating his chest and stamping his feet right now. Beimeng paid a great price for this assassination. Yu Qingling felt as if she was struck by lightning. Beimeng's military god Tuoba Bodhisattva, and Li Mibi the ancestor of spies, which one of them wasn't a terrifying figure? Su Fengyan said apologetically, "After I step into the Snow Lotus building, your identities will soon be discovered. Among the forces in Snow Lotus City the only threat is Western Shu. But don't worry, Western Shu can't take care of itself in a short period of time. In addition, their spies have always been weak. Furthermore, I will also send a group of Fu Shui House's men of sacrifice here. If there's no accident, the leader will be called Fan Shaochai. If necessary, the Finger Xian Sword Grandmaster Mi Fingjie will also accompany her. Because Snow Lotus City cannot be abandoned for the time being, I need the Snow Lotus House, which has the innate advantage of being close to the water tower, to help keep an eye on the changes in the situation between Western Shu and Nanzhao. In the future I may force you to go to Nanzhao and contact some people." Madame Song smiled and said, "It's Snow Lotus Building's great honor to be able to contribute to Mount Qingliang and Fu Shui House. I won't refuse even if I have to die 10,000 times." From the corner of Yu Qingling's eyes, she could see that Madame Song was in high spirits and had a warm smile on her face. This was very different from the Madame Song in her memory. Ever since Yu Qingling settled down in the Snow Lotus House when she was young, the Madame Song in her memory had always been a serious and cold person. Even when facing the courtesans like Yu Qingling, she was always stingy with her smiles. This was the first time Yu Qingling knew that a Madame Song who smiled from the bottom of her heart was like a finishing touch. Soon Yu Qingling calmed herself down and tidied up her chaotic emotions. She handed the young man a cup of sparrow-tongue tea that was picked from the old tea tree on the top of Tianmu Peak in Nanzhao. Yu Qingling took advantage of the short time when he reached out to take the teacup and casually glanced at him. He was not stupid. If he was only treated with respect by Madame Song, then all the hidden leaders of the Fu Shui house in Beiliang were qualified. However, if it was a battle with Tuoba Bodhisattva, and there was a sense of victory and defeat, then the identity of the handsome man in front of her naturally came to light. In the entire Beiliang, there was only one person who was more powerful than Chu Lushan, the Fu Shui house's behind-the-scenes leader who was also the protector general of Beiliang. Prince Liang Su Fengyan. Yu Qingling could not help but sigh. He was really young. Su Fengyan did not care about Yu Qingling's little thoughts. He leisurely drank tea while casually chatting with Madame Song about the local conditions and customs of Snow Lotus City. Moreover, he had been entangled with Tuoba Bodhisattva for more than half a month and was constantly on the verge of death. He also needed to learn about the situation of Liang Mang's battle and the changes in the world from the Snow Lotus House. However, the Snow Lotus House was located in a small city outside the Great Wall in the southwest border. Its geographical location could not be compared with the 8 houses in the Nanzhao Kingdom of Western Shu. The Snow Lotus House was only in the middle of the 72 houses inside and outside the Whispering House. However, Madame Song's identity was so special that even Chu Lushan had a whole new level of respect for her. In addition, Su Fengyan and Tuoba Bodhisattva had fought all the way from the northern part of the western regions to the southern part of the western regions. Therefore, the Whispering House sent some extra spies to the Snow Lotus House so that once Su Fengyan entered Snow Lotus City, he would be the first to receive the news. However, Su Fengyan only knew that Lu Gui's Hutu city was still intact. The construction of the huge new city in the northern part of Liangzhou province, which was even larger than Hutu city, was about to begin. In the area of Qingcang City in Liuzhou province, the Longxiang army and Lu Gui's army had a probing battle. Both sides suffered losses that were within the acceptable range. Furthermore, after Crouching Gong and Luanhe cities were breached by Beimeng's vanguard General Zhong Tan, Shaguang City also fell to Beimeng's all-out offensive. The Tiger Pouncing Camp, which had been personally approved by the King of Beiliang and personally issued a military order in the name of the Beiliang Protectorate and Chu Lushan, had once made outstanding contributions to the Yuzhou infantry headquarters. From the main general Sun Shu to the 23 captains and 47 deputy captains, to all the soldiers, the 2,726 people in the camp had all died in battle. Yu Qingling didn't know why, but when she heard these concise words from Madame Song's mouth, She felt as if she could hear the sounds of battle drums, battle cries, smoke, corpses, faces covered in blood and unsheathed Baelyang sabers. She didn't know when, but when tears streamed down her face, she saw the young vassal king leaning back in his chair and drinking tea. His face was expressionless and indifferent. Yu Qingling, this lowly chess piece of the Fu Shui chamber who had worked so hard to become a second-class concubine, suddenly couldn't help but feel angry. She suddenly felt a surge of courage. She stared straight at this young man who could at times openly wear a python robe. Her eyes were filled with doubt and resentment. The soldiers at the border were sacrificing their lives for you, for your Su family. Could it be that you couldn't show a bit of grief? Could it be that just because they were one of the 300,000 cavalrymen of Baelyang, they had to die as if it was right and proper? They couldn't even be bothered to make you frown. Madame Song said softly, since the battle between you and Liang provinces started, no one from the Baelyang frontier army has surrendered. Su Fingyan nodded and said, before Beimang's army enters the border, even if some of us are willing to surrender, Beimang won't accept it. Yu Qingling was supposed to pour tea for him and refill his cup, but she put down the teapot heavily to vent her anger. Then she smiled bitterly. With the mentality of death, she wanted to ask this young vassal king whether he had a heart or not. Chapter 1482. But before Yu Qingling could open her mouth, Madame Song, who was very experienced in observing people's expressions, said sternly, shut up. Yu Qingling, get out. Yu Qingling stood up absent-mindedly and left the room in a daze. Madame Song smiled bitterly and said, Prince, Yu Qingling is just a child. She has lived her whole life in Snow Lotus City without any wind or rain. She doesn't know anything. Please don't blame her. Su Fingyan bent down and picked up the teapot. He poured a cup of tea for himself and also poured a cup for Madame Song. He shook his head and said, it's fine. Madame Song said softly, Snow Lotus Building is a Mandarin duck building with two buildings connected by a corridor in the sky. That's why it has the reputation of pavilion in the sky. The front building is mainly used for banquets and tea. Guests usually come in at night and leave in the morning. The back building is used for accommodation. Most of the guests who are familiar with Snow Lotus Building can enter. It's just that this servant doesn't know if Prince wants to live in the back building or find a quiet house nearby to rest. It's not far, it only takes half a cup of tea's time. Su Fingyan smiled and said, it's not too troublesome. I'll just live in the back building. Madame Song was a bit hesitant. The back building had a first-class room that was not inferior to a marquis's house. However, Snow Lotus Building was filled with people from all over the world. There were many rich people who spent a lot of money to stay in this gentle place. Often they would stay for 10 days to half a month. Dirty things often happened in this place. What Madame Song meant was that she hoped that the young prince could choose a quiet courtyard in the noisy place. Otherwise, it would be inappropriate for the dignified king of Baelyang to live on the same floor with those men. However, since he said so, Madame Song didn't add more feet to the snake. She led Su Fingyan down to the 6th floor and walked through the unique corridor. When they arrived at the back building, Madame Song didn't ask the women in Snow Lotus Building to prepare the clothes he needed to change into after bathing. She did everything herself, even pouring water into the bathtub in the room. As for the matter of volunteering herself to sleep with him, Madame Song didn't dare to expect it, nor would she think about it. In the brothels of the world, no matter how beautiful you are, no matter how many men you have under your skirt, aren't they all mediocre? Growing out of the mud without being stained? Did she really think that she was a female bodhisattva sitting on a lotus platform? Su Fingyan, dressed in rags, walked Madame Song to the door. He took off the cold knife, took a bath, changed his clothes, shaved his beard and trimmed his nails. Finally he felt refreshed. And then he sat down in front of the table. His mind stirred slightly. The remnants of the flying swords that Dong Tai gave him years ago flew out of his sleeve and floated about a foot away from the table. Black armor, childhood sweetheart, morning dew, spring water, peach blossom, moth may, vermilion bird, huang tong swan, golden thread tea. At first there were a total of 12 flying swords, each containing 12 different sword forms. The sword forms were already clear in his heart, but after several great battles, there were only 4 flying swords left. Childhood sweetheart, huang tong swan. People often say that things remain the same but people change. However, on Su Fingyan's side, it was people who relied on old things that gradually disappeared. Su Fingyan did not put away the 4 flying swords that depended on each other. He let them rest quietly on the table, closed his eyes and began to breathe. The reason why Daoists were proficient in the art of breathing and advocated returning to simplicity was because there was a saying that when a newborn baby fell to the ground, it would spit out the turbid qi from his previous life. Young children often cried because they did not hide the turbid qi in their abdomen. They did not know the art of breathing and nourishing their body, but their jinqi naturally existed for a long time. Therefore it fit the word, naive. When a person grew up, although he learned to endure things silently and liked to praise someone's maturity by not showing his joy, in the eyes of Daoists, it was contrary to his nature. Su Fengnian was half asleep and half awake. He was in a trance. He breathed in and out and his mind was retracted and released. At this moment he could hear many movements inside and outside the Snow Lotus Tower. The next moment, it was as if the world was completely silent. Su Fengnian thought of the blind old soldier Su Yongguan from the fish drum camp, who sent him off 600 times on his way to the capital post. He thought of the Yuzhou cavalry who fought from Ji Bay to the mouth of the calabash. He thought of many people and many things. After an unknown period of time, Su Fengnian was awakened by the sound of light footsteps outside the door. He suddenly realized that the lanterns outside the window were already lit. Su Fengnian put away his flying sword and walked to the window, lost in thought. After this battle, Su Fengnian was confident that it would not take long before he could fight Tuoba Bodhisattva to a draw. He would also be able to compete with Dong Tai, who had the strongest killing power among the 4 grandmasters. As for Cao Chongqing, who was considered to be the most famous among the 4 grandmasters, but was only considered to be the last among the 4 grandmasters. After all, Tuoba Bodhisattva was publicly recognized as the number 2 who would only lose to Wang Xianji. Dong Tai had also improved after Li Chungang lent him his sword and went to the sea to visit the Immortals. Su Fengnian used the momentum of defeating Wang Xianji in one move and his reputation in Jianghu was like the sun in the sky. Only Cao Chongqing had not fought with a grandmaster of the same cultivation level for many years. Even though he appeared briefly with Ginger in Great Peace City, he did not fight. He only fought with Gu Jiantang, Lu Hao and the others. There was no real life and death battle. Therefore, compared to Su Fengnian, Dong Tai and Tuoba Bodhisattva, it was inevitable that he would be looked down upon. However, Su Fengnian was well aware that after Confucian sage Cao Chongqing changed his mind, not only was his cultivation base the highest among the 4, he was also the one with the strongest battle prowess. At this time, Cao Chongqing might not be inferior to himself when his celestial being physique was at its peak. Outside the room, Madame Song brought along the elite men of sacrifice of the whisk chamber whose names Su Fengnian still didn't know. She gently knocked on the door. After getting permission, Madame Song pushed the door open and said, Lu Huaishi came to visit Snow Lotus House alone. I didn't dare to make a decision on my own, so I had to disturb Prince's rest. Su Fengnian smiled and said, Let's go and meet him together. I'm also very curious about this legendary figure who ruled over a region. Madame Song, when the time comes, just tell him that I'm the new guard of Snow Lotus House. Madame Song smiled faintly and endured. Su Fengnian joked, indeed. Even if Snow Lotus House is rich and overbearing, it doesn't seem like they can afford to hire a hired thug like me. The 3 of them walked together in the corridor that was covered with Western shoes gorgeous silk. After turning a corner, they passed by a room. Coincidentally, a guest opened the door and a group of people filed out. There were 4 men and 1 woman. The woman wore a purple dress with a purple scabbard and a delicate purple bamboo flute hanging from her waist. The woman was beautiful, but her face was cold and distant. The other 3 young men had different styles. The leader had a lively personality and a delicate face. He jumped out of the door with his hands crossed behind his back. He was talking to a tall man with sword-like eyebrows with a smile. The other person had the demeanor of a noble family. He had a jade-like face and was dressed luxuriously. He was whispering to an old man with graying temples who carried a sword on his back. The 2 groups of people bumped into each other. In fact, each side took a step back and brushed past each other lightly. However, the men of sacrifice who led the way for Su Fengnian and Madame Song did not intend to stop. As for the young master who went out first, he was probably used to being spoiled by the elders at home, so he did not have a good temper. He blocked the way in the middle of the corridor, shook his shoulders and squinted his eyes and laughed. Madame Song frowned slightly. Su Fengnian shook his head without batting an eyelid. Madame Song understood tacitly and said to the top master of Snow Lotus House who wanted to barge through, Meng Li, forget it. Chapter 1483. Hearing Meng Li's name, only the old man with the sword on his back twitched his eyelids. Other than him who was experienced in Jianghu, it was the first time for the others to enter Snow Lotus City. Although the juniors around him were not unscrupulous disciples who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth, the purple-clothed woman and the pair of siblings were from sects and clans that were outstanding in the southwest province. As for the tall young man with no foundation, he was also a rare rising star. They looked down on this small border city from the bottom of their hearts. However, the old man had heard of Meng Li before. He rarely fought in Snow Lotus City, but it was said that he had a death battle with a few experts under Lu Huaishi. Most of the latter disappeared from Jianghu, and Lu Huaishi was recognized as a second-level master. Since Meng Li was still alive, it meant that either the Snow Lotus House was not to be trifled with, or Meng Li had the ability to challenge Lu Huaishi. The old man believed that he had reached a higher level in Jianghu, so even if he was not afraid of Meng Li, he still had to be cautious when facing such a local tyrant. It was better to avoid trouble. Just as the old man was about to take a step back to avoid trouble, the young woman who was dressed as a man clicked her tongue and said, "Forget it? What a big tone. Who are you? If you don't forget it, what else do you want?" The purple-clothed woman who had arrived at Snow Lotus City earlier than her companions sighed softly. She then said to the disciple of a noble family who looked somewhat similar to the young girl, "That woman is the head mistress of the Snow Lotus House." The young man nodded. He was born in a prestigious family and did not have any intention of causing trouble. He smiled at the arrogant girl and said, "Damn girl, come back." The young woman was unwilling, but she was no longer aggressive. However, someone quickly added fuel to the fire. The eyes of the tall young man, who exuded an aura of savagery, burned with passion as he stared fixedly at Madame Song, whose skin was still as charming as that of a young girl's. "You're Madame Song from Snow Lotus City, the woman who even the Deputy General of Yi Province in the Western Shu Empire couldn't win over?" He grinned, revealing his white teeth. "Mrs. Song, my name is Zhang Wuho. I'm the guy who peed in front of the Zhao family's mansion. I've admired you for a long time." Mrs. Song didn't get angry because of the young man's frivolous words. She smiled and said, "I know." The young girl was clearly very dissatisfied with the man beside her who was fickle-minded. She coldly snorted and looked at Madame Song with even more provocation. "Zhang Wuho, what are you admiring? She's old enough to be your mother." Marquis Zhang Wuho, whose name had shaken the southwest of Liang because of his unbridled behavior, smiled and said, "This little girl doesn't understand Madame Song's kindness." The old man with the sword on his back was deeply worried. That elegant young man was also helpless. However, it would be a big joke to say that he was afraid of offending the entire Snow Lotus City. Su Fengnian didn't expect these people to be so bold. He didn't want them to continue insulting Madame Song, so he smiled and said, "When you're outside, you should speak properly. At the very least, you should speak human language." Then Su Fengnian turned to look at Madame Song. "Don't tell me that everyone wants to carve the words 'come and hit me' on their faces when they walk the streets nowadays? I didn't have this courage back then." Madame Song smiled and said, "These people are probably either the disciples of Wang Xianji, Chao Chongqing, or the sons and daughters of the feudal princes and princesses of Liang. That's why they're so bold." Su Fengnian laughed and said, "Even if that's the case, it still doesn't make sense." Madame Song, who seemed to be speaking in riddles with Su Fengnian, nodded and deliberately said with a look of realization, "Oh right, it still doesn't make sense." The young girl was furious and said angrily, "Shameless adulterers. Don't even think about leaving here today. I don't care if you're Madame Song or not. You're still a prostitute and an old one at that." Madame Song was completely indifferent. She had used a short span of 12 years to turn the Snow Lotus House into the largest brothel in the southern part of the western regions. Even Lu Huaishi had no choice but to tolerate this thorn in his side. How could she be defeated by a little girl with a few words? If it weren't for the king of Bailiang by her side, she would have been able to easily leave a psychological shadow in the young girl's heart for the rest of her life. As a death warrior trained by the whisk room, Meng Li attached great importance to the rules. As long as Madame Song didn't say anything, he wouldn't do anything even if he had a strong killing intent. However, a sinister smile had already appeared on his face. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "That's enough. The young girl sneered and said, "You're just a pretty boy raised by an old woman. Who do you think you are? You think you're qualified to talk to me?" Zhang Wuho was originally a daring person and he also had an astonishing backing. He chuckled and said, "You're not convinced? Why don't we spar? If you win, we'll make way. If you lose, Madame Song will be mine. How about it?" Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Spar? Sure." After saying that, he slowly walked forward. Meng Li quickly took the initiative to retreat and make room. His eyes were blazing with madness and even his hands and feet couldn't help but tremble. He was one of the 4 grandmasters of the world. How many people could see the 4 of them in action? In the blink of an eye, the young girl didn't even notice anything strange. Then a deafening sound came from behind her. She then discovered that Zhang Wuho had turned into that passable-looking young man who had the most repulsive smile. It turned out that Zhang Wuho had been pushed out by Su Fengnian's palm on his forehead. He crashed through the wall, passed through the room and broke through the wall again. Just like that, he fell out of the 8th floor of the Snow Lotus Tower. Among the group, the old man with the sword on his back had the highest cultivation. However, he didn't see how this young man with an ordinary aura attacked. The old man instinctively reached out to pull out his sword. Su Fengnian only stood beside the young girl and looked at the 2 eye-catching holes. He waited patiently for a long time before turning his head and looking at the shocked Grandmaster of the Southwest. He asked with a smile, "What's wrong? You can't even pull out your sword?" At this time, everyone discovered that the Grandmaster of the Sword, who was unreachable in their hearts, had reached out to grab the hilt of the sword on his back. The sword, which weighed no more than a few kilograms, seemed to be as heavy as a mountain. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't move it in the slightest. This scene was too ridiculous and comical. This accidental disturbance seemed to be an ordinary quarrel, but in reality, everyone in the group had their own schemes. Not to mention the pitiful person who had already fallen out of the Snow Lotus Tower. The girl in purple wanted to borrow the power of the Southwest Jianghu to make a name for herself. For a heroine to walk the Jianghu, winning the title of fairy, was only the first step. She still needed a variety of methods to manage it. She needed to climb up to a towering tree so that she could intimidate others. She needed to be on good terms with the seniors, carefully win over young masters who had money and family background, and so on. On the road of Western Shu, the awe-inspiring son of an aristocratic family had sharp eyes. He had seen the old-style cold saber on Su Fengnian's waist. His family had suffered a lot at the hands of the Su family, so they wanted to skin the Bailiang Su family alive. As for the dandy sons of Western Shu who liked to wear cold sabers, he had personally killed and crippled many of them over the years due to his anger. Now that he had met such a person in Snow Lotus City, other than disliking him, he wanted to test the waters. He wanted to create a farce and reveal some of the old secrets of the Snow Lotus Tower. If she really had an affair with Bailiang, then he would have a merit that he could easily obtain. As for the girl who was angry at Zhang Wuho's fickleness, how could his eyes not light up? Her thoughts were very simple. In front of a strange man she was interested in, she just wanted to make him keep his eyes on her. Su Fengnian looked at the embarrassed old man who had drawn the sword and said pleasantly, "Take your time, I'm not in a hurry." After a while, the old man, who had been famous for a long time, struggled in vain. When he was about to lower his head and admit defeat, he suddenly pulled out more than half of the long sword in the sheath. Even the old man himself felt that it was unbelievable. The 2 women and 1 man who were staring at the old man felt relieved. However, the long sword in the old man's hand returned to the sheath by itself. Out of the sheath back into the sheath. This process repeated again and again. The old man wanted to die. Madame Song suddenly burst out laughing. She had never felt so comfortable in more than 10 years. Chapter 1484. The old man with the sword on his back loosened his grip in disappointment. The clear heart of the sword that he had nurtured for decades was completely broken. His expression was dull, and he had lost the demeanor of a grandmaster. The purple-clothed woman, who had painstakingly earned the title of fairy, had an indifferent expression on her face that was as cold as ice. She wanted to say something, but she couldn't. Her watery eyes seemed to be able to speak, and there were actually 3 kinds of emotions in them: reverence, admiration, and guilt. The man from the Western Shu family put away his thoughts of fishing in troubled waters and put on a submissive posture. He tried to maintain the bearing of a disciple of a noble family, and did not show too much of an opportunistic attitude. His sister was the biggest contrast. Newborn calves were not afraid of tigers. Not only did she not shrink back, she widened her eyes. The only thing that was not written on her face was that she wanted to marry him. Madame Song did not add insult to injury. She stopped smiling and came to Su Fengnian's side. As if there was no one around, she began to introduce everyone to Su Fengnian. Purple Bamboo Fairy Huang Chunyu is from the Sword Mountain, which is only ranked after the Spring Invitation Cottage. Her master is the Donyo Peak Master, Deng Chong. She was a guest at General Lu's mansion some time ago, and she just came to the Snow Lotus house yesterday. If I'm not wrong, the brother and sister are from the Lu family in Izhou. As for this senior who is unwilling to, disdainful to use his sword, he is called Wan Jinghua. He is one of the few Jianghu masters in the Western Shu sect. There was once a poet who praised his sword skills as 1,000 riders rolling up snow over a great hill. Therefore he has the nickname of 1,000 Riders Sword Immortal, in the southwest Wulin of Liang. The old sword immortal, who had just come back to life, almost spat out blood when he heard the word disdainful. His face was pale and his lips trembled violently. Su Fengnian finally looked at the old man and asked with a smile, "You are Wan Jinghua? When you were young, you admired the sword god Li Chungang, so you gave up literature to practice martial arts. You even wrote the famous poem 3 Feet? The old man was stunned for a moment. This swordsman with no spirit left nodded slowly. Su Fengnian said unexpectedly, "Excuse me." Wan Jinghua only felt that it was unbelievable. Even Madame Song was confused. Su Fengnian laughed softly. "There was once a senior swordsman who said that your talent was average and that your swordsmanship would not be good. However, your poems were not vulgar. Wan Jinghua should not practice swordsmanship and should be a scholar." What surprised the Lu siblings was that after a moment of confusion, Wan Jinghua seemed to have been possessed by a ghost. Tears streamed down his face as he cried and laughed. He was like a slow-witted child who had been taught a lesson in private school every day and was suddenly praised by a strict teacher one day. At the same time, he was like a poor scholar who had spent his entire life in dire straits. Suddenly one day he felt that he could die at night after hearing about the Dao. Huang Chunyu, who was imitating the Wulin Alliance leader Huishan Xinyuan, who was wearing a purple robe, discovered that the three of them were already far away. Wan Jinghua was still intoxicated. For a long time he was unable to extricate himself. He raised his head and muttered to himself, "Without a case, without a scabbard, the dark room's night is always bright. A 3-foot wooden horse and ox could break all the soldiers in the world. I want to know that the sky is about to rain and the dragon cries out. Walking in the world with a sword, 100 ghosts travel in the night. Flying over the Guangling River, 800 dragons are frightened. People do not know what they want. But the man in green robe laughs. If the heavens did not give birth to me, Li Chungang, the way of the sword would be like a long night." On the way to Lu Huaishi's room, Madame Song explained, "According to the spies, the wanderer called Zhang Wuho has secretly joined the new Yi province general. The main figures of the Yi province's Lu clan and the elite guards of the Sword Mountain were also honored guests of the Yi province's provincial governor's mansion. Furthermore, with Huang Chunyu's foreshadowing, it seemed like the purpose of their trip to Snow Lotus City was to win over Lu Huaishi. Prince, do we need to keep these people in the Snow Lotus Pavilion?" Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "There is no need to completely fall out with the Western Shu Dao for now. After all, the Snow Lotus Pavilion is too far away from Bailiang, and Fan Shaochai has not arrived yet. Once we encounter a situation where we will fight to the death, it will be difficult to quench our thirst. Collecting spies is the most important task of the Snow Lotus Pavilion. It has been in the past and will be in the future. The general trend of the northwest and southwest, and the decline of Bailiang and the rise of the other side, depends on the hundreds of thousands of cavalry and spears. As for the Snow Lotus Pavilion and the Whispering Room, if one less person dies and one more spies are sent out, they may be able to change the situation of the war and influence the whole world." Madame Song said softly, "My vision is too narrow." Su Fengnian stopped and looked at Madame Song. He said helplessly, "Madame Song, my mother and Aunt Zhao are old friends. Aren't you afraid that I will feel uneasy when you call me your servant?" Madame Song's eyelids drooped slightly. She reached out to stroke the hair on her forehead and did not say anything. In the room, Yu Qingling was brewing tea. It was not ready yet, so Lu Huaishi was patiently waiting for the tea. When Madame Song and the unfamiliar young man walked into the room, Yu Qingling was just about to brew the tea. Lu Huaishi sighed and said, "Madame Song, you came at the right time." Madame Song sat down and Su Fingyan stood behind her respectfully. Lu Huaishi smiled and asked, "May I ask who this young master is?" Madame Song's lips curled up for a moment. She said softly, "Young Master Su is Meng Li's junior martial brother. His skills are excellent." The majestic Lu Huaishi waved his hand and laughed. "If that's the case, why don't we sit down and drink some tea together? I respect scholars all my life, but the ones that are to my liking are the Jianghu men with hard fists and hard bones. Unfortunately, I am the guest today and Madame Song is the host. Since the Snow Lotus Pavilion only provides tea, I can only drink it obediently. Just based on Madame Song's praise of my skills, when young master visits my humble abode in the future, we must drink to our heart's content." Lu Huaishi did not care about trifles. He had an indescribable charm that made it easy for people to have a good impression of him. He was an ambitious person in the western regions in his prime. His boldness did not make people feel as if they were looking down on him. The parents and officials who ruled over a region loved the people as if they were their own children. The generals and soldiers shared weal and woe with each other, and the nobles treated the wise with respect. Although it was rare, the sharp-minded people could still more or less feel the alienation brought about by the difference in status. The Lu family's disciples were gentle, kind, and thrifty. However, when Lu Huaishi spoke to someone, his eyes would look at the other person. He was sincere and free. Every word that came out of his mouth seemed to come from the bottom of his heart. When he saw Su Fingyan sitting down, the smile on Lu Huaishi's face deepened. He then bargained with Madame Song. "Madame Song, young Master Su is a straightforward person. Even if you don't want to give me face, can you give face to young Master Su and ask Miss Yu to bring 2 pots of good wine for him? A dog butcher's big bowl of wine and big chunks of meat. You're a nobleman in the human world." Yu Qingling revealed an inquisitive look. Madame Song nodded. The former swayed her body and slowly left. Lu Huaishi patted his stomach and smiled. "Madame Song, I don't have many tricks up my sleeve. If there's something I want to say, let's get straight to the point. As for whether we'll fight or kill and whether we can drink young Master Yu's wine, it'll all depend on the will of the heavens. Of course, I'm not lacking in sincerity. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here alone and drinking tea. Yes, of course, there are 200 of my brothers outside the Snow Lotus restaurant. I didn't want to be sneaky. They're all out in the open. Anyone can see them. After all, I'm only a second-grade master. I don't have the ability to overturn your Snow Lotus restaurant. Not to mention other things, at least I can't bear to let the women in your mansion become widows." Madame Song laughed it off. Lu Huaishi raised his cup and drank the tea in it. He continued, "Not to mention Madame Song, anyone with a brain in Snow Lotus City can guess my ambition. General Lu's mansion, of course I want to be a real general. As long as someone can give me the title of general recognized by the imperial court, I'll be a true local emperor. As for whether it's Beimang Li Yong, the Bailiang behind Madame Song, the white-clothed war Saint Qin Jibao of Western Shu, or the King of Yen from Nanjiang, it doesn't matter. If someone can give me the right price, I'm willing to use the wealth I've accumulated over the past 20 years to bring a few thousand of my brothers to the battlefield." Madame Song smiled and said, "Once you're in the territory of another family, aren't you afraid of being bullied by others? A few thousand people are enough to dominate Snow Lotus City. As long as you leave your hometown and join the army, even if you're in the Western Shu path, which has the least number of soldiers, I'm afraid you won't be able to speak as loudly as you do now." Lu Huaishi rubbed his chin and laughed heartily. "That's why it's one thing to wait for the right price to raise one's status. It's another thing to open one's eyes and find a family that's easy to get along with. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been unable to get the title of general until today. To be honest, Huang Chunyu, who lives in Madame Song's Snow Lotus Pavilion, is just one of the many forces that have offered to recruit me. Other than the Western Shu path promising me the title of a general with a surplus title and the right to command 3,000 troops, the Southern Jiang offered me an even higher price. A secret messenger from the Dragon Palace promised me the title of a general of the lower third rank Fenwu General, and one of the generals of the Liang Imperial Court. He also promised me that as long as I reach Nanjiang, I'll be promoted to the position of a general on the same day. Furthermore, all the brothers who leave Snow Lotus City will not be separated. Not only that, he also promised me an additional 6,000 troops. As for the Zhao family of Liang, Someone from the Weaver Bureau of Western Shu also came to my mansion. It's just that he's a little petty, so I won't mention it. However, Madame Song continued, the northern barbarians offered the highest price. It's definitely impossible for you to become a general of the Beimeng, but at the very least you'll be a general's. They might even promise you that after you conquer Baoyang and conquer the Central Plains, you'll be a governor of the border. At that time you'll have enough military merits and the title of a prince with a different surname will be just around the corner. However, General Liu isn't sure about the outcome of the war at Liangmang. He's afraid that Baoyang will bully the weak and fear the strong. He's even more afraid that Beimeng will send you to Liuzhou or Lingzhou to die. Isn't that right? Chapter 1485. Lu Huaishi laughed and said, Mrs. Song, you're so insightful. I think you're more than qualified to be an assistant minister of the Ministry of War in Liang. Lu Huaishi suddenly lowered his voice and narrowed his eyes as if trying to hide his sharpness. Rumor has it that there's a Wutongin on Mount Qingliang. Women from the Hanlin Academy will replace the young vassal king. It's not bad for Mrs. Song to be a female scholar in that Baoyang. Yu Qingling brought 2 pots of wine. It was Baoyang's green ant wine, which wasn't a rare thing. Even in the capital, which hated Baoyang, green ant wine was still popular, especially among the people. The spicy green ant wine was very popular. Because of its low price and high quality, it was the best choice in Liyang's water transport system. Yu Qingling placed 3 bowls on the table. After filling all 3 bowls, the aroma of the wine assailed their nostrils. Yu Qingling knew that although Mrs. Song rarely drank, her alcohol tolerance was astounding. Drinking wine was like drinking water. It was easy for her to make 2 or 3 so-called wine heroes collapse. Mrs. Song picked up the bowl and drank it in 1 gulp without saying a word. Lu Huaishi also drank the green ant wine in 1 gulp. When he reached out to ask for more from Yu Qingling, he looked at Mrs. Song and said self-mockingly, Madam, I think I'm quite straightforward today. Can't Snow Lotus House give me a straightforward answer as well? Su Fengnian finally spoke. General Liu isn't very straightforward. Lu Huaishi smiled and turned to look at the only man in more than a decade who could make Mrs. Song willingly serve as his foil. Oh, what do you mean, young master? Su Fengnian looked at him and said calmly, Yesterday there were 2 fights in the alley in the northeast of Snow Lotus City. In the first fight, General Liu lost his adopted son, who was qualified to take on a great responsibility. In the second fight, General Liu personally watched from a distant building. Although he couldn't see clearly, he couldn't determine the depth of my skills. He probably couldn't guess the identity of the 2 riders who entered the city late at night and left this morning. However, compared to that swordsman Xiao Mu of the Central Plains, compared to Meng Li of the Snow Lotus Tower outside the house, and compared to you, General Liu, it is obvious that I am in a higher realm. Most importantly, you brought 200 of the mansion's most elite troops and rushed over aggressively, with the idea of subduing the enemy without a fight. The reason why you had the spy you planted in Snow Lotus Parlor tell them to hold back their troops before I entered the room was because you, Lu Huaishi, learned of my true identity at the last moment. That person was afraid of my cultivation, so he didn't dare to speak. Maybe he wrote King of Baoyang, or Su Fengnian on the table with tea, right? Mrs. Song raised her head and glared at Yu Qingling. The latter's face instantly paled. Lu Huaishi put down the wine bowl and rested his hands on his thighs. Then he stood up and bowed with cupped fists. Commoner Lu Huaishi greets Prince Liang. Then Lu Huaishi raised his head and grinned. You can kill me or torture me as you wish, Prince Liang. But Lu Huaishi only asks for one thing, and that is, don't blame this girl. Su Fengnian took a small sip of wine. The weather was still cold in late spring and Lu Huaishi was soon sweating profusely. Su Fengnian smiled. General Liu, take your men back to the mansion first. This king still needs to consider what price Baoyang will offer. Alright, when you go back, send the Snow Lotus to Snow Lotus Parlor. Lu Huaishi bowed and left the room. Inside the room, Mrs. Song's face was cold. She grabbed the porcelain bowl that was still filled with green ant wine and smashed it on the head of Yu Qingling, who was kneeling on the ground. The wine seeped into her hair and mixed with the blood on her head. Mrs. Song wanted to kneel down as well, but found that she couldn't stand up from the chair. Su Fengnian smiled. I don't want to comfort Mrs. Song, but what happened today isn't a bad thing. Mrs. Song glanced at Yu Qingling and gritted her teeth. According to the rules of Whisk Shui Room as Yu Qingling's guide, the lightest punishment I can receive is to break one of my arms. Yu Qingling kowtowed on the ground and said in grief, "Mrs. Song, I deserve to die. Your Highness, please don't punish Mrs. Song. Yu Qingling is willing to commit suicide as an apology." Su Fengnian sneered. "Yu Qingling, Lu Huaishi begged for mercy for you and you begged for mercy for Mrs. Song. But do you believe that you were sincere?" Lu Huaishi on the other hand was scheming to protect himself. He seemed manly but in reality he was a vicious person who relied on his instincts to make the best decision. Perhaps you're wondering why I could see through it and think that I, Su Fengnian, am slandering Lu Huaishi, who has always been open and aboveboard even when doing evil things. Su Fengnian laughed at himself. If you really want to give a reason, it can only be explained that I'm also a cold-hearted person. It's always more accurate for a bad person to see another bad person. It's not that I can't force Lu Huaishi to kill you in order to live. It's just that when your emotions were fluctuating, Lu Huaishi was also certain that I wouldn't kill him easily. If he acted casually in front of you, you would only be more infatuated with him. Who knows, you might even bite your tongue and commit suicide. Yu Qingling only had a trace of doubt in her heart, but she quickly raised her head with a firm gaze. "I won't." Su Fengnian wiped the edge of the wine bowl with his sleeve and handed it to Mrs. Song. He directly picked up the wine jar and drank a mouthful of wine. He said indifferently, "Actually, whether I kill Lu Huaishi or not is a small matter because Lu Huaishi can't decide who to side with. Before I appeared he could only choose to side with Western Shu. This guy is full of lies. For example, he said that the offers from Western Shu and Nanjiang were real, but the offer from the Weaving Bureau of Liang Imperial Court was fake. The reason why Lu Huaishi didn't agree was because he knew that it was just a pie on paper. No matter how big the pie was, he couldn't eat it. The forces of Western Shu under Qin Jibao's command might be able to tolerate a General Lu of Shuelian City who ruled over a territory and allowed him to live freely on the border. However, they definitely wouldn't allow Lu Huaishi to lead his people anywhere. As long as he dared to take a single step out of Shuelian City, he was doomed to die. That was why the one Lu Huaishi truly wanted to rely on was the Northern Mang that he thought was a sure win. That was why he was waiting. Only when the Northern Mang took down Hutu City and invaded Liang Province's territory would he declare his stance. If by any chance Northern Mang suffered a defeat in this war, he would settle for the next best thing, switching to Western Shu's embrace. Qin Jibao didn't attach any importance to a person like him and the several thousand stragglers he brought with him at all, undoubtedly breaking up his troops. Of course, this was Lu Huaishi's plan before he met me. After tonight, if he had an urgent need, he would open the temple door without burning incense and offer pigs and sheep when the time came. On the surface, Beimang was loyal to him and didn't have a good future, but secretly contacted Western Shu. If you don't believe me, I can ask Madame Song to send you to personally monitor the meeting between General Lu's mansion and Western Shu. When the time comes, you will definitely be disappointed with Lu Huaishi. Su Fengnian suddenly smiled. However, Yu Qingling will definitely not be able to resist going to Lu Huaishi while you're monitoring him. He just said a few words and your heart softened again. It's not your fault. Fu Shui's room and spy are all inferior to the person you like. Yu Qingling lowered her head again and bit her lips. Life was short but love was long. Su Fengnian stood up and walked to the window. He looked at the night scenery of Snow Lotus City, which was like a paradise. It must have been hard for Lu Huaishi to resist the temptation of your body. Did he personally promise you that he would only consummate his marriage with you after officially marrying you? Yu Qingling finally broke down and sobbed silently. Madame Song asked Meng Li, who was outside the room, to take Yu Qingling away and lock her up. She came to Su Fengnian's side and said with a bitter smile, "I've made a fool of myself in front of your highness. I've also disappointed your highness." Su Fengnian shook his head and didn't say anything. Madame Song forced a smile and no longer called herself a servant. "I'm very curious. Why is your highness so tolerant of Yu Qingling? If it were me, I would also ruthlessly kill her." Su Fengnian leaned against the window and said with a smile, "It's very simple. Because my mother once told me that the world is not good. It's harder for women to live, especially beautiful women. So my mother told me that when I grew up I shouldn't bully people if I could. I should treat them as well as I can." Madame Song stared at the young man and smiled gently. "Unfortunately, I, Song Huang, was born more than 10 years early." Su Fengnian turned his head and blinked. He asked, "Isn't Madame only 20 years old this year?" Chapter 1486. Madame Song, who had a high tolerance for alcohol, blushed as if she had drunk 1,000 white cups of wine. Is that so? But I was already 16 years old when I first met the general and the princess with the young lady. Zhu Fengnian smiled. The two of them leaned against the window. After a long time, Madame Song said softly, "Every minute of the night is worth 1,000 gold. Young Master Su, do you want to rest? Do you need someone to serve you?" Zhu Fengnian said seriously, "The bed in my room is a bit small." Madame Song spat, stood up straight and turned to leave. She said, "I just don't like to be eaten by an old cow." "What do you mean by looking 20 years old? Who are you trying to fool?" Zhu Fengnian smiled and said, "If you have the chance, go back to Baoyang. My sister will be very happy." She stopped and sighed. She shook her head and left the room. Zhu Fengnian took the wine jar from the table and leaned against the window to look at the brightly lit Snow Lotus City. After drinking more than half of the wine, there was a knock on the door. He turned around and said, "Come in." Swordsman Xiao Mu and the young boy and girl who were taking refuge in the Snow Lotus building walked into the room together. Xiao Mu cupped his fists and said, "Young master, I have received the Snow Lotus. I will go to Baoyang to work for you in half a year at the latest." Zhu Fengnian nodded and smiled. "I trust you." Ma Jiabao's daughter immediately gathered her courage and asked, "Hey, Senior Sword Immortal, did you win against Tuoba Bodhisattva?" Zhu Fengnian joked, "After the fight I vomited a few pounds of blood. Do you think I won?" The young girl exclaimed, "So miserable?" The young boy said carefully, "Uncle Xiao said that your opponent is the second most powerful expert in the world, the army god of Beimang. Senior Sword Immortal won't be embarrassed if you lose by accident." Zhu Fengnian looked at Xiao Mu, who was deeply grateful to him, and said, "I will leave Snow Lotus City early tomorrow. Please go to Ma Jiabao. You can bring Meng Li from the Snow Lotus building. He is also a second-grade master." Xiao Mu nodded and did not refuse. The youth suddenly blushed and asked, "Senior Sword Immortal, that heartless old man likes to lie. Why don't you tell me the truth? If I practice martial arts, can I become an expert? If I don't have any achievements in martial arts, then I'll just be an honest lotus collector in the future." Zhu Fengnian smiled and said, "Your aptitude isn't very good, but your luck shouldn't be bad. Otherwise, you wouldn't have met that old man Xiao Mu and most importantly me. So I'll give you a suggestion. Do you want to listen?" The young man nodded vigorously while pecking at the rice. The young girl rolled her eyes and said, "Grow up." Zhu Fengnian said, "I have a brother who traveled alone in Jianghu before he became a top-notch swordsman. You can ask Uncle Xiao to take you to Jianghu in the Central Plains. If you think it's boring to travel alone, you can elope with Miss Ma." The young man was at a loss. He looked forward to it and felt nervous. He smiled foolishly at the young girl. The young girl pointed at Zhu Fengnian and said angrily, "Is there a senior sword immortal like you who wants to do nothing but play tricks? Hong Shuji wants to travel in Jianghu, fine. But if he wants to follow you, you have to teach him swordsmanship." Zhu Fengnian joked, "Oh, you haven't married him yet, but you already know how to make plans for him?" The young girl turned her neck and acted like a rascal. "Just tell me if you agree or not." Xiao Mu rubbed the young man's head. Then, with eyes full of smiles, he pretended to be angry and glared at the young girl. "What's wrong? Little Ma, do you dislike Uncle Xiao's martial arts? Although Uncle Xiao can't compare with Senior in Snow Lotus City, I can still fight with Lu Huaishi for hundreds of rounds. In Uncle Xiao's hometown in the Central Plains, the descendants of the 4th or 5th rank local officials want to be my disciple and learn the sword. Miss Ma, you have to eat one bite at a time. Don't eat until you become fat. If that happens, it won't be you who dislike Uncle Xiao, but Hong Shuji who doesn't want you anymore." Compared to Zhu Fengnian, who killed people with bloody means, the young girl who was closer to Xiao Mu said shyly, "Uncle Xiao, you're not a good person either. Hong Shuji will become bad sooner or later if she follows you. I'm worried." The young girl stomped her feet and ran out of the house with Hong Shuji. They started to discuss how to elope and travel in Jianghu together. Xiao Mu cupped his fists and said sincerely, "Senior, take care." Zhu Fengnian hesitated for a moment and said with a smile, "I'm not a senior. I'm younger than you." Xiao Mu was stunned and said, "Senior, you're very humorous." When Xiao Mu walked out of the house, two women walked in together. They were the purple bamboo fairy, Huang Chunyu, and the arrogant woman from the Lu family who couldn't control her mouth. Zhu Fengnian was a little self-deprecating. Had he become the most popular courtesan in a brothel? The woman from the Lu family who had changed back into a woman's dress questioned, "You broke Marquis Zhang's tendons and destroyed his martial arts. You made him live a life worse than death. Aren't you afraid of revenge?" Su Fengnian didn't pay attention to the woman with small breasts and no brains. He looked at Huang Chunyu, who came from the Sword Mountain, and asked, "What's the matter?" Compared to the arrogant woman from the Lu family, Huang Chunyu naturally had more experience in Jianghu and knew how to deal with people. She didn't pretend to be a girl of Jianghu. Instead, she bowed like a weak and virtuous woman. After straightening her slender waist, she said in a soft and apologetic voice, "Grandpa Ruan has left Snow Lotus City. He said that he wants to follow the footsteps of a senior and travel with a sword. Grandpa Ruan asked me to tell you that he has no regrets in this life. He also said that he already knows your identity, but he won't say a word. Grandpa Ruan also said that in his lifetime he will write a famous poem for you." Su Fengnian leaned against the window with some kindness in his eyes. "Okay." Huang Chunyu's eyebrows were like flowing autumn water. She said tirelessly, "Our Sword Mountain accounts for nearly half of the 10 sceneries of Western Shu. They are the Bamboo Sea, Old Lord Pavilion, Lingyun Stone Buddha, and the Moonlight Cauldron. If you pass by Western Shu in the future, I hope you can come to the Sword Mountain to enjoy the scenery. If you don't mind, I can lead the way for you." Su Fengnian smiled. "If I have the chance to go to Western Shu in the future, if I still have the leisure to enjoy the scenery, then I will definitely go to the Sword Mountain." Huang Chunyu smiled innocently. It was hard to imagine that she was the cold beauty who was famous in the Jianghu of Western Shu. Su Fengnian said casually, "I once went on a long journey and only went to Mount Qingqing. I missed your Sword Mountain. If I may ask, I don't know if the old ancestor of your Sword Mountain is still alive. I only know that the old ancestor went into seclusion to comprehend the sword many years ago. There has been no news of him in Jianghu for so many years." When it came to the secrets of the sect, Huang Chunyu's expression was a little awkward. For a top sect, it didn't matter how many people there were. It only depended on whether there were first-class masters and how many there were. Therefore, whether the old ancestor of the Sword Mountain was dead or still in seclusion was a world of difference. Old Ancestor Du of the Sword Sect was a martial arts grandmaster who had fought Li Chungang on his way to Shu for the sword trial. He was a rare existence in the entire Western Shu. To say that he could defeat Sword God Li in that era was tantamount to a fool's dream. It was not even wishful thinking to hope for a tie. If the current Jianghu of the Central Plains was a scene of heroes rising together, then thinking back to the past, Li Chungang alone was the Jianghu and all the outstanding people. Su Fengnian did not force her. He smiled and said, "If he is no longer alive, help me propose a toast to Old Ancestor Du. If Old Ancestor Du is still alive, please help me pass on a message." The Tang Sword Chi scripture that Old Ancestor Du wrote when he was in the prime of his life. The 2 moves of pulling the Sky River and washing the troops' armor were quite imposing. Huang Chunyu nodded her head gracefully and obediently. The woman of the Lu family who was ignored pointed at Su Fengnian and said angrily, "Do you think I am blind? Do you know who I am?" Su Fengnian asked back, "Are you the Empress Yan Donggu? Or Xinyuan Qingfeng of Mount Hui? Or Qingyu?" Then Su Fengnian said coldly, "If you are not, then get out of here." She bared her fangs and brandished her claws, shouting, "I will bite you to death," as she ran towards Su Fengnian. Huang Chunyu quickly said goodbye and hugged this reckless girl's waist, quickly bringing her out of the house. After Huang Chunyu stepped out of the door, she suddenly turned around and said with a smile, "Young master, I almost forgot to tell you. Grandpa Ruan said that he has already thought of the title of the poem. It will be called The Journey of the Fierce Blade in the Snow." Chapter 1487. The second chapter is Before Midnight. The third chapter is Before Midnight. Su Fengnian had already left the city when the sky was still dark. Madame Song personally saw him off and the two parted at the city gate. Lanterns were hung high on the city wall, making it as bright as day. Su Fengnian noticed that Madame Song, who was dressed elegantly, had not only changed into a red-yellow wide-sleeved gown, but also seemed to have put on some makeup. She sat high on the horse, her beautiful skirt trailing behind her. Under the illumination of the lanterns she looked especially beautiful. Su Fengnian had already discussed all the matters that he needed to pay attention to in the Snow Lotus house. Feigning civility with the fence-sitter Lu Huaishi was of the utmost importance. The spies from Bailiang and Western Shu would use this person as bait. Su Fingyan wore the old cold knife that had broken into 2 pieces at his waist. He carried an inconspicuous cotton bag with a few changes of clothes and some yellow and white items on his back. As they parted, Madame Song lived up to her reputation as the woman who had written the phrase, carrying a knife and standing alone in all directions, shining through the clouds at night. She did not show any signs of embarrassment and smiled as she cupped her fists and said, "Even if you accompany a friend for 1,000 miles, you still have to part in the end. Take care, Your Highness." Su Fingyan nodded and reminded, "Like I said before, the Snow Lotus House is only the Snow Lotus House. There is no need for you to personally participate in the battle. Unless it is absolutely necessary, don't try to be a hero. It is not easy to find a 3-legged toad, but there are plenty of 2-legged men who want to be heroes." Madame Song smiled and said, "Is that so? I thought all men were 3-legged." Su Fingyan laughed it off and then said seriously, "Don't think that I am being overly sentimental. It is fine if Bailiang and Western Shu coexist peacefully. However, as long as Qin Jibao turns his attention away from the Central Plains, he will soon reveal his true intentions. At that time, not just your Snow Lotus House, but all the strongholds of the Fushui House in Western Shu and Nanzhao will be uprooted overnight. I don't need to say much about Qin Jibao's style of doing things. That is why I have already asked Chu Lushan to arrange your escape route. All of you are priceless treasures of Bailiang." Madame Song's eyes were calm and peaceful. Su Fingyan took the cold blade from his waist, which had been broken in the fight, and threw it to Madame Song. "Northern cold blade only kills outsiders." Su Fingyan's figure gradually disappeared into the distance. Madame Song held the cold saber and slowly raised her hand. She was unwilling to put it down. The simple and austere saber and the slender and delicate arm formed a sharp contrast that could capture one's soul. The burly Meng Li had appeared in the shadows near the city gate. His eyes were complicated and his face was gloomy. Ever since this taciturn man had volunteered to be sent to Snow Lotus City 12 years ago, he had conscientiously helped Song Huang build a tall building from the ground. 2 8-story Mandarin duck pavilions were unique even in the rich and fertile land of West Shu. He had been through life and death situations for more than 10 years. Time and time again he had to dress his wounds alone. Time and time again he looked at that figure from afar. He could see it, but he could not catch it. Meng Li leaned against the city wall. His expression was uncertain. In the eyes of this bloodthirsty man, Madame Song was like a bunch of enchanting begonias in a silver vase. He was willing to stand in the distance and watch the flowers slowly wither, but if someone wanted to pluck the flowers and put them in their sleeves, no matter who that person was or what status they had, Meng Li would be worried. At some point, Madame Song had put on her cold saber and rode to the foot of the city wall. Meng Li stood in the shadows. She should not have seen his strange expression. Suddenly Madame Song reached out her hand and fanned near her nose. She mischievously said, "Meng Li, why do I smell jealousy?" Meng Li's face instantly turned red. He was at a loss. Madame Song dismounted and led the horse forward. Meng Li hesitated for a moment before quickly following. Madame Song said softly, "Meng Li, I already know what you're thinking." While Madame Song was probably thinking of some gentle words, Meng Li had already bitterly said, "Madame, I also know." Madame Song stopped and patted Meng Li's shoulder. For the first time she looked at this man with a rough face but a delicate mind. She was in high spirits. Her limpid eyes were overflowing with color. She pointed at the Central Plains and said boldly, "Meng Li, you're a man. Why do you have to be so pretentious? Maybe I, Song Huang, will never like you in my life. However, you can make me remember that there is a man named Meng Li. The border of Liangmang is already filled with the smoke of war, and the Central Plains will soon be filled with war drums. You've been reading books on the art of war all these years. Do you want to stay in Snow Lotus City and waste your time, or do you want to go out and fight?" Meng Li was silent for a long time. Finally he said, "Madam, can I not go to the Bailiang Frontier Army but go to Liangmang instead?" Madame Song handed the reins to Meng Li and laughed. "Why not? From now on, Whispering Room and Snow Lotus House will just treat Meng Li as dead." Meng Li suddenly mounted the horse and turned it around. After galloping for a dozen steps he turned around again. He clenched his fist and hammered his chest. "Song Huang, I, Meng Li, have liked you for 12 years. I've also done my best to protect you for 12 years. I don't regret it. Even now I'm still very happy. If I become successful in the future, I'll definitely come back to Snow Lotus City to find you. If I unfortunately die at the border of Liangmeng, I hope you can offer me a few cups of wine every Qingming festival." Madame Song laughed loudly and said, "Don't die if you have the ability." Meng Li left the city and went to Liangmeng alone. At this time Song Huang and Meng Li did not expect that in the future Liang Shilin and Jiang Hu to jointly create the two auspicious talismans rushing north, torrents. Meng Li had unknowingly become one of the first people to set off. Su Fengnian, who had left the city earlier, also did not expect that he would coincidentally encounter a martial arts event in the remote western regions. This caused him to stop for a while on his way back to the north. In the past 100 years, because Li Chungang and Wang Xinji had been too powerful, the entire Jianghu under them was like a fight between ants no matter how much trouble they caused. In addition, Li Chungang and his sword were too elusive. Later on, Wang Xinji's hands were tied in the martial emperor city of the Eastern Sea. This caused the Jianghu of Liyang to be lively for 100 years, but in the end, it was not as lively as before. It wasn't until Xianyuan Qingfeng became the chief of the Wulin alliance that this situation began to change. Of the four grandmasters Su, Chao and Tuoba, none of them were pure Jianghu people. Dong Tai appeared and disappeared mysteriously, and the other 10 martial arts judges were also shrouded in mystery. This made Xianyuan Zi, who was rumored to be admired by the emperor of Liang and who the new prince of Liang wanted to gift with the martial arts manuals, become the undisputed leader of the Central Plains Jianghu. Apart from the publicly recognized top 10 sects, the Sword Tomb of the Wu family, the Dragon Palace of Nanjiang, and the Fish Dragon Gang of Bailiang were at the bottom of the list. After the Martial Arts Society meeting at Great Snow Ping, many new lists were released near Liangxin. These lists abandoned those martial arts grandmasters and Jianghu sects that were too high in status. They were newly evaluated as the 4 fairies, the 4 sages and the top 10 sects. In addition, there were also titles such as the 12 chiefs and the 8 demon lords. Although these lists were no longer lofty, it was precisely because they were approachable that they were as vigorous as weeds. Soon, everyone in Liangjiang knew about them. Under this general trend, 2 major events occurred in the bustling Liangjiang lake. One was that Xianyuan Qingfeng had come out from his closed-door training. In just half a year he had comprehended the passive immortality, and his realm had skyrocketed. He was born from the 12 chiefs of auspicious talisman of the 13 grades of spring and autumn. Xianyuan Qingfeng was the chiefs of sword, saber and Dao. The second major event was that while Xianyuan Qingfeng was in closed-door training, someone had stolen 16 of the best martial arts manuals from the library in Great Snow Ping. Later it was said that 6 of the 8 big figures of the evil way had joined hands to do it. Then a second martial arts society meeting was held in Great Snow Ping. Although Xianyuan Qingfeng did not show up, under the leadership of Huang Fengfua, the chief guest of Mount Hui, he set the tone of the battle between good and evil with those respected sect leaders. For a time, all the heroes gathered and were excited, vowing to hunt down and kill the 6 evil people who dared to challenge the number 1 holy land in Jianghu, Great Snow Ping. The first-class Jianghu forces carrying the banner of enforcing justice on behalf of heaven set off from Mount Huishan, passed through Xiangfan in the middle of the Central Plains, passed through western Shu, and tirelessly chased the enemy all the way to the western regions. Along the way, countless second- and third-class gangs joined in. Whether they had nothing better to do and wanted to join in the fun or wanted to build a relationship with Mount Huishan, in short, the flow from east to west was getting bigger and bigger. There were thousands of people. The movement was so big that not only the garrisons of Jiangnan Circuit and Western Shu Circuit were alerted, they were in a state of panic for a while. Moreover, it was said that even the young nobles of the Zhao family secretly joined in. Most of them just wanted to see the purple dress of Mount Huishan. A few of them secretly recruited the forces of Jianghu in order to seek self-protection in the imminent turmoil. Therefore, it could be said that the fish and the dragons were mixed together to participate in the grand undertaking. Chapter 1488. At that time, Su Fengnian was riding alone and stopped beside a gravel path that was trodden by traveling merchants all year round. He was a little dumbfounded. This path was actually filled with endless streams of people, and it was a rare scene of a boiling cauldron of voices as if they were going to a market. Among them, there was a group of Jianghu men who were dressed in bright clothes and were riding on horses. The other women were holding zither, kongho, hule and other musical instruments. Most of them were Jianghu men who were roaming the Jianghu. They were dressed in bright clothes and riding on horses. The swords and sabers on their waists were all valuable weapons. Among them, more than half of them were wearing white robes and white robes. There were also a few who were unconventional and had wooden swords on their waists. In the mighty group there were also people riding donkeys and carrying branches. Naturally, these guys were the firm admirers of the peach blossom sword god, Dong Tai. Su Fengyan had been to Liang Lake twice. The first time he felt like he was walking at the foot of the mountain, where he could only crawl and roll in the mud without being able to see the scenery at the top. The second time he walked on the top of the mountain, like an immortal who was enjoying the clouds and drinking the dew. It was really an eye-opener for him to see so many Jianghu men who were too good to be humble in one breath. Su Fengyan stopped his horse and didn't move forward. He didn't have a horse that was worth hundreds of gold coins, nor did he carry any weapons. In fact, he was not eye-catching. 4 ordinary young people who wandered the Jianghu, even if they had a first-class appearance, they didn't mean much to men. Even for women, if they didn't know how to build connections, they could only be a heroine with a little reputation in a county of Banzhou. It was hard to be called a fairy. Even if they saw Su Fengyan, the men just glanced at him and the women just looked around. At most, they would look back and take a second look. They felt that it was a pity that this handsome young man was not from a famous sect. Otherwise, they could find a chance to win him over. It should be known that the top 10 new talents in the Wulian world were all related to the 10 great sects of the 4 sages. For example, Dou Chongfeng, who had a toad-like face, liked to stick out his tongue and lick his lips when he was free. Eating at the same table with him would make one lose appetite. Just because he had a good master who had a place in the great snow square of Mount Hui, he was always surrounded by women. Su Fengyan looked at the crowd in front of him quietly and sighed with emotion. Previously, the spy had sent a message to the Snow Lotus Tower that Tantai Ningjing had rushed to the Guangling Taoism. Chao Chongqing's transition from the holy path to the domineering path was undoubtedly another proof that the Confucian sages of the past dynasties often didn't have a good ending. It should be known that under the devil suppression well in the water moon mirror, there were those famous Confucian sages who were famous for their benevolence and righteousness. In the eyes of ordinary people this must be a strange thing, but in the eyes of the Qi trainers in the world, this was the cycle of the heavenly way. After confirming that Su Fengyan was out of danger, Su Yanbing took a newly accepted disciple to the pass in the south of Lingzhou bordering Liangshu to meet his fellow disciple Han Lao's Han. It seemed that he was entrusting his son to him. Perhaps he didn't want to have any regrets before the life and death battle with Huyen Daguan. Suddenly, someone laughed loudly and swept across the yellow sand. Although this person was excellent in martial arts, he didn't offend the crowd by flying over the heads of the people in the middle of the path. Instead, he rode on the wind beside the path of the unknown people like Su Fengyan. His figure rose and fell like a dragonfly skimming the surface of the water, bringing up bursts of yellow dust. Su Fengyan was wrapped in the dust. After the master flew over the man and the horse, the yellow sand hit them in the face. Su Fengyan didn't care about it and just casually scattered the sand. Around him were a lot of people who were forced to eat the sand and curses. A young pedestrian closest to Su Fengyan was stepped on by the flying master on the shoulder. Although he wasn't injured, he staggered and bumped into Su Fengyan's mount. Su Fengyan bent down and gently held the poor guy's head. After letting go, the man raised his head and didn't seem to be flustered and exasperated. He said gratefully with a good temper, "Thank you, young master." Su Fengyan shook his head and asked with a smile, "Where are all of you going?" The man's eyes widened. "Young master, are you from the western regions?" Su Fengyan nodded and said, "I'm heading north from Snow Lotus City. I'm very curious as to why so many Jianghu heroes suddenly appeared here." The young man with an old cotton bag on his back laughed and said, "No wonder, no wonder. Young master, you don't know. Not only are there nearly 1,000 Jianghu heroes on this road, but all the masters of the Central Plains are also heading west. They are divided into 3 groups and are heading to a small town in the western regions dozens of miles away. They are going to meet the Wulian Alliance chief there and discuss how to kill the 6 great devils together. In fact, there aren't many first-class grandmasters on this road. The other 2 groups are full of masters. Hey, it's just that they are moving too fast. My legs can't keep up with them, so I have to settle for the next best thing." Su Fengyan dismounted and walked forward with the cheerful young man. The latter couldn't help but take a few more glances at Su Fengyan's mount. His eyes were full of undisguised envy. Su Fengnian saw that the young man looked tired and his footsteps were light. He smiled and asked the young man to take off his bag and hang it on the horse's back. The young man didn't stand on ceremony and sincerely thanked Su Fengnian. He took the opportunity to pat the back of the horse a few times and praised it for its excellent colt. The young man saw that this young master didn't seem like a rich man who was difficult to get close to. Moreover, this young master was a lively person who couldn't keep his words to himself. Therefore he opened his mouth and told Su Fengnian about the scale of this trip to the western regions. His face was brimming with pride as a Central Plains man. Without needing Su Fengnian to ask, the young man took out his family's wealth. He came from Yonglu County, Gangnam-do, which was the richest in the world. His name was Xianxia, and his master was one of the last consecrated elders in the county. However, he was only one of more than 10 disciples in name other than the direct disciples. This time, there were more than 20 people from the sect who were heading to the western regions. However, they were all proud disciples of the sect leader and the 3 deputy sect leaders. They were not on the same side and couldn't join in the fun. Therefore he had to travel alone. After talking about his family's affairs, Xianxia, who boasted that he was the messenger of Yonglu County, began to introduce Su Fengnian to the important people on the road. Hey, do you see those women in front who are all playing musical instruments? Don't underestimate them just because they are girls. They are all extraordinary. They are all fairies from the Misty Mountain, the second largest sect in Huainan Dao. The Misty Mountain only accepts women and is divided into 2 peaks. The women of the 2 peaks are seated according to the positions of the ceremonial courtesans and ceremonial courtesans. Alright, these courtesans are definitely not prostitutes. Young master, you must not blaspheme against them. You must know that the Misty Mountain sect leader, the Flying Cicada Fairy, has a technique to retain her youthful appearance. She is already 50 years old, but she is still as graceful and moving as a 16-year-old woman. Even in the great snow plateau of Mount Hui, her seat is also very close to the front. Her reputation in the Jianghu is also extremely good. After our Wulian alliance chief came out of seclusion, he discussed the Jianghu together with 18 leaders of the righteous path. The Flying Cicada Fairy is one of the 18. As for those nuns, they come from the Jingxi nunnery of the southern peak Zen Mountain. In the past year they have been competing with the Tranquil Heart Monastery, which also established a sect in the southern peak Zen Mountain, for the position of Mountain Lord. It is said that the Wulian Alliance chief will recognize whoever makes the greatest contribution this time as the master of the southern peak. The one at the front is a big monk who is 10 feet tall and has a red sandalwood bead around his neck. His nickname is the Red Sandalwood Monk. He is a famous expert in Liaodong. Currently there are 16 loose immortals in the Jianghu and he is one of them. It is said that when he was young he found an old ginseng that was only 10 years away from being 1,000 years old. He bitterly waited for it for a full 10 years. After eating the old ginseng, his internal energy greatly increased, and he was able to become a loose immortal. I heard that the string of the red sandalwood Buddhist beads is made of the roots of the old ginseng. Even if you have a divine weapon that can cut through hair, you can't cut it. The group of young masters and daughters riding horses are all disciples of the famous Orthodox sects in the Jianghu, which is an important martial arts town in the southeast of Liang. I call these people the second or third generation of the senior generation. Don't the officials have the second generation and the descendants of the generals? They are all disciples and grand disciples of the local martial arts grandmasters who are famous in Jianghu. Naturally, they are the second or third generation of the senior generation. As for me, forget about it. My Taiga sect. I'm not afraid of being laughed at by young master, but in reality, there's no way for us to compete with those 4 or 5 top-notch sects in the county. We can only shut our doors and pretend to be masters. My direct disciple brothers can only show off in the county. Once we leave our hometown, aren't we just serving tea to other people of the same age who come from famous sects? Anyway, I can't stand it anymore. I'm happy to be free and unfettered. At least I don't have to act according to other people's wishes. Su Fengnian patiently listened to the young man's long-winded chatter with a tranquil smile. Shin Chongging's mouth was dry from talking. Su Fengnian handed him a pot of green ant wine that he had brought from the Snow Lotus Tower. Shin Chongging, who had never tasted this kind of wine, did not know the severity of the situation. He took a big gulp and felt as if his throat was on fire. His face turned red and he coughed continuously. When he handed the pot back, he said awkwardly, "This wine, is really fierce. Su Fengnian saw a few riders passing by from the corner of his eyes. One of the riders was a woman whose breasts were undulating along with the back of the horse. He chuckled softly and said, "Is it as fierce as this heroine?" Xin Chongging's eyes lit up. They were both men, so they quickly understood each other's intentions. He felt closer to this young master who was not pedantic and inflexible. He nodded with a smile and said, "What an imposing manner." Chapter 1489. Unable to control his emotions, Xin Chongging's voice was not soft. The riders had unusually sharp ears, so they quickly reined in their horses and turned their heads, glaring fiercely at the two slick and poor fellows. After one of the escorts dismounted, he walked toward them with a ferocious smile. Xin Chongging admitted that he was in the wrong, but he did not want to implicate the young master beside him. He took a few steps forward and cupped his fist, wanting to admit his mistake. Unexpectedly, that person did not give him the opportunity to report his name and sect. He raised his foot high and stomped on Xin Chongging's chest. The travel-worn Xin Chongging's lapel shook with a burst of dust. Under the huge impact, he was sent flying backward in the blink of an eye. Su Fengnian reached out to support Xin Chongging's back and deliberately took a few steps back before he barely supported Xin Chongging's body. Su Fengnian gently pulled Xin Chongging behind him and raised his elbow to block the kick. Then he looked up at the smiling heroine on horseback and said with a smile, "We were rude first. I hope everyone can forgive us." Xin Chongging's face turned red. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "We were rude first. Please forgive us." The strong young man who did not achieve anything obviously felt that he had lost face in front of the fairy. He deliberately kicked up the yellow sand with the tip of his foot as he ran forward. He made a set of dazzling fist moves with his hands and dust flew up. He was so imposing that he shouted angrily, "You're looking for death. Forgive you my ass. Grandpa will teach you how to be a man today." But what happened next made the young man's group and all the onlookers on the road not know whether to laugh or cry. They saw the handsome young man pull the troublemaker behind him and run away. He didn't even care about the horse turning around and running away. The strong young man spat and did not bother to chase. He got back on the horse and continued to talk and laugh with his companions. Recently there was a new custom in Liangjianghu. The reason was that before Mount Huishanzi became the rightful Wulin alliance leader, there was a famous contest in Jianghu at the end of the series of famous battles at Quicksnow Mountain Villa. Her opponent was a famous Jianghu figure in his 70s. He had a fiery temper and spoke rudely. In the end, not only was he defeated by Xianyuan Qingfeng, but he also forced the old Jianghu figure to acknowledge her as his grandaunt. In these 2 years, with Xianyuan Qingfeng's unstoppable rapid rise, there were all kinds of father-son and grandfather-grandson fights in Jianghu. Whoever lost would be the son or grandson, and whoever lost would have to call the other father or grandfather. After Xianyuan Qingfeng became the #1 person in Jianghu, challengers were as numerous as carps crossing the river. Her practice was the same as Wang Xinji's in Martial Emperor City. The loser would have to leave his weapon on the weapon collecting platform. She did not make anyone acknowledge themselves as her grandson, but many busybodies began to count on their fingers and took the initiative to help this ZZ figure out who she would accept as her grandson today and who would become Mount Huishan's son tomorrow. Many people who were slow on the road could not help but roll their eyes when they saw the two running back to take the horse. A few young girls even covered their mouths and laughed. Even the thick-skinned Xin Chongging was a little embarrassed. But after seeing the calm face of the loyal young man beside him, he felt relieved. He patted the footprint on his chest and said in a low voice, "Brother, I've implicated you this time." Su Fengnian shook his head and said with a smile, "What's there to be implicated about? I'm used to it." Xin Chongging had a big heart and did not dwell on this small incident. He looked at the blurry figures in the distance and said jokingly, "I should have known. That's an omen." The two slowly walked along the small path in the crowd. Xin Chongging told the young man beside him about the current Jianghu situation. This is a once-in-a-century battle between good and evil. The elites of the Central Plains are all here, led by the Moonless House in the Great Snow Plateau. Among the new 10 major sects, the Quicksnow Villa by the Lake of Spring, the Dragon Palace in Nanjiang, the Gangnam-do's Black Drum Stage, the Yuyan Villa that rose again with the help of the Dragon Rock Sword Furnace, Taibai Sword Sect, Jinsua Saber Manor, Shishu's Spring Invitation Cottage, plus the veteran Dongyue sword pool and Bailiang's fish dragon gang. The 10 major sects are all here. There is a rumor in the Jianghu that the mysterious finger grandmaster Huang Fengfua is the leader of Mount Hui. As for the whereabouts of the Wulin Alliance chief, no one knows. The only daughter of the Quick Snow Villa's manor lord, Weiqi Liangfu, is traveling in the Jianghu for the first time. The Dragon Palace's palace lord Lin Hongyuan is personally leading a group of top experts. The Yuyan Villa's young manor lord Zhang Chunlin is traveling west alone with 3 famous swords. The Taibai sword sect, which once had a land sword Immortal, has finally produced a young swordsman who is known as the banished Immortal of the Sword Dao. It is said that he has received the guidance of the Peach Blossom Sword God. In just half a year his Sword Dao realm has improved by leaps and bounds. He has broken through the 2nd grade, 1st grade Vajra realm and the mysterious finger realm. Therefore this person is also known as the 4 young grandmasters, together with the person who is currently staying in Martial Emperor City, Xianxia of Mount Longhu, and the manor lord of Jinsua Saber Manor. They are regarded as the most outstanding figures who won't lose to the 4 grandmasters in the future. This guy who is not even 18 years old, isn't he powerful? Su Fengyan smiled and nodded. Yes, he is very powerful. Shen Chongging sighed. Among the 4 young people, the manor lord of Jinsua Saber Manor is actually more famous than the banished Immortal of the Taibai sword sect. It can't be helped. She is not even 30 years old, but she is already a genuine saber master. Moreover, she is one of the 4 fairies who are famous in the world. She is as famous as the Dragon Palace's palace lord Lin Hongyuan, the Fish Dragon Gang's gang leader Lu Nirong, and Lu Hunxian of the Dark Drum stage. Su Fengyan couldn't help but interrupt. Is the Fish Dragon Gang's gang leader also very beautiful? Shen Chongging was a little puzzled. Of course, it is said that Lu Nirong, who visited Mount Hui with the martial arts manual, is as elegant as a fairy. Moreover, she is the least arrogant of the 4 fairies. She has a very good reputation in the Jianghu. Su Fengyan didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I see. Shen Chongging said worriedly. It's just that this extermination of the evil demons is not a sure thing. It is said that one of the demons is a local snake in the western regions. He has thousands of horse gangs under his command. His combat power is not inferior to the iron cavalry of the Bailiang frontier army. Moreover, the other 5 demons are also very powerful. During their escape they have recruited many notorious scums in the Jianghu. Several of them are also at the Master Realm. They can't be underestimated. But I think that evil will not prevail over good. We have Fairy Lu of the Fish Dragon Gang, who is familiar with the terrain of the western regions, to lead the way. Moreover, we have the leader of the Wulin Alliance who has superb cultivation. I think we will definitely win. It depends on how much we pay. Su Fengyan whispered. It seems that there are many acquaintances. Shen Chongging didn't hear Su Fengyan's muttering. He patted his chest and said, although I am not famous in the Jianghu, I know a few people. When we arrive in that town I will definitely introduce you to them. Chapter 1490. However, Shen Chongging soon realized that his boasting had been exposed. The town, which could only accommodate 400 to 500 people at most, was already overcrowded. It had long been occupied by the big shots of the top 10 gangs and the disciples of the second-tier sections. Those with solid connections and thick pockets had also entered the town through the back door. These people who could stay in the restaurants and inns were naturally superior to others. Next were the Jianghu forces stationed at the edge of the small town. Most of them were reputable sects in the provinces and counties, but they could only obediently set up their tents. Next they would have to eat and sleep in the open. As for a nobody like Shen Chongging, in addition to the fact that he had arrived late, he could not even find the Jianghu disciples from the same county that he was familiar with in the dense crowd. He stood half a li away from the small town and could only stare helplessly. Su Fengyan held back his laughter and did not speak, lest this boastful fellow beside him become even more embarrassed. Fortunately, there were some local residents in the town who were good at making money. They pushed their wheelbarrows and started a small business. They sold some dry biscuits, wine and dried dates. Shen Chongging endured his headache and bought 2 small bags of dried dates at a high price. He and Su Fengyan each had a bag of dried dates. A small bag of less than 20 dried dates cost 1 tael of silver. Shen Chongging wanted to cry but had no tears. He squatted in the crowd with Su Fengyan, munching on the dates and muttering gloomily. Su Fengyan looked around. It was naturally difficult to see familiar faces in the vicinity. Obviously, he did not expect to see any Jianghu people he was not familiar with. This made Su Fengnian, who was hoping to try his luck and meet Lin Hongyuan of the Dragon Palace, lose interest in staying. He wanted to continue north after eating the dates. Su Fengnian took the pot of green ant wine from the horse's back and handed it to Shen Chongging, who had been coveting it but was too embarrassed to ask for it. Shen Chongging opened the cork and shook his head. He was not in a hurry to eat it. Many men and women nearby were envious. This made young hero Shen, who was trying to find joy in the midst of bitterness, very satisfied. Su Fengnian squatted on the ground and slowly threw a jujube into his mouth. He wondered why Xianyuan Qingfeng had made such a big fuss. The so-called six devils were not worthy of her attention. As for Shen Chongging's claim of monopolizing the top three, Su Fengnian had some meaning that outsiders would not understand. Useless monk who had died in the hands of Chao Chongqing, most likely had met Xianyuan Qingfeng before he was alive. This great master who made the imperial court bow to him 100 years ago, taught Xianyuan Qingfeng everything he had learned in his life. Lu Songtao did not focus on swordsmanship at that time, but he had the demeanor of a sword immortal. Otherwise he would not have been able to kill the sword immortal of Jianghu at that time. With Lu Songtao's amazing talent, he must have a unique understanding of bladesmanship, which allowed Xianyuan Qingfeng to bravely advance on the path of swordsmanship. Before Zhao Huangchao of Dragon Tiger Mountain died, he had turned into a black rainbow and flew to the snowfield. When he met with Su Fengnian on the snowfield, she deliberately hid this matter. However, both of them were shrewd people who knew each other well, so Su Fengnian was too lazy to expose it. As the main character Hui Shanzi had not arrived in the town yet, so everyone could only wait. Everyone was bored to death. Fortunately, in this banquet where the banner of justice was held high, it was natural for people to make friends with each other. However, every time a late Jianghu big shot passed through the crowd and entered the town, the crowd would burst into thunderous cheers. Of course, those people's reputations in the whole Jianghu would rise to a higher level. Originally they were just heroes in a remote corner, but now they would soon spread all over Liang Jianghu. Su Fengnian squatted in the crowd and laughed at himself. Among the 14 people who participated in the martial arts evaluation, he must be the only one who was stupid enough to stay here and drink the northwest wind. Su Fengnian suddenly smiled at Shen Chongging and said, "Look up." Shen Chongging was stunned. He raised his head and looked at the cloudless sky. It was empty and there was not even a bird defecating above his head. But soon Shen Chongging suddenly opened his eyes wide. Compared with most of the Jianghu people inside and outside the town who were slow to realize what was going on, he was definitely the lucky one. A purple rainbow quickly fell into the town from the distant sky. Shen Chongging's eyes were dull and his mind was swaying. It took him a long time to come back to his senses. He even forgot why the person beside him had such foresight. He just rubbed his cheeks hard and explained to the person with emotion, "It must be the chief of Wulin. How is it? Is it?" Su Fengnian nodded before Shen Chongging could say anything. "Yes, it's very powerful." Shen Chongging laughed loudly and poured the remaining red dates in the bag into his mouth. Then, in a fit of excitement, he imitated the legendary land sword immortal who could invisibly kill people with sword chi. He spat out the dates with a few puffs. As a result, one of the dates fell on the back of the head of a man sitting on the ground in front of him. In fact, the force was very light and it did not hurt or itch. But in Jianghu one had to pay attention to face more than life. The man suddenly turned his head and saw Shen Chongging, who was first stunned and then pretending to look up at the scenery with his mouth closed. He got up and rolled up his sleeves to give the little bastard a few slaps. Shen Chongging's face was sullen. He turned his head and looked at Su Fengnian, planning to run away again. However, Su Fengnian took the wine jug from his hand and threw it high to the man. He laughed and said, "Brother, don't be offended. If you want to beat people up, we'll accept it. But the world is big and drinking is the most important thing. Drink up first." The man subconsciously caught the wine jug and smelled it. His face was intoxicated and he drank it all in one gulp. His whole body quivered and he gently threw the wine jug back. He glanced at the horse behind Su Fengnian and raised his arm to wipe the corner of his mouth. He laughed heartily and said, "It's strong enough. If you don't mind, we still have some bacon left. Why don't you try it together?" The two groups of people, 7 or 8 rough men, sat in a small circle. The man used a dagger to cut the bacon that was less than 2 caddies heavy. Everyone, including Su Fengyan and Shen Chongqing, had a share. Su Fengyan took out a few taels of silver and bought about 10 caddies of wine. Someone was so happy that he slammed his bowl on the ground. This enraged the townsfolk who sold wine in bulk and could lend their bowls to the customers, but he did not dare to say anything. Fortunately, since Su Fengyan had already revealed his true colors, he simply gave all his taels of silver to the vendor. He bought the cart of 40 to 50 caddies of wine and 2 large lamb legs in one go. Su Fengyan's wealth made the originally reserved atmosphere suddenly warm up. Drinking wine and eating meat was better than being a noble. Although the wine was of poor quality, it was still intoxicating after drinking a few caddies. One of the men who could not hold his liquor drank the most, and soon he was 70 to 80% drunk. The man who sat on the ground slapped his thigh. He was probably one of the people in the group who had studied and learned to read. He had a rare scholarly air about him. He acted as if there was no one else around and proudly sang, pawning a famous sword to buy inferior wine, killing the barbarians in Longsheng Liangzhou. The wind chimes in the grassy pavilion said, "Ding ding ding, after death shall enter the martyr's shrine." While everyone was waiting for him to continue, the man shook his head and mumbled that he was really drunk. Then he leaned back and fell to the ground, snoring loudly. The man who knew Su Fengyan first laughed and said, "This guy studied in a private school for a few years. He always said that he was talented but was not recognized. After drinking, he liked to speak in a sour language that we don't understand. He's not like this usually. In fact, he's the kind of person who can't take his eyes off a woman's big buttocks." Not far away, a group of people looked at each other angrily and said, "What are you talking about? Is it the death of his parents or his wife?" The man who was talking to Su Fengyan stood up and pulled out his sword. The two sides were immediately at loggerheads. At this time, an unfamiliar woman with a graceful figure and a bridal hat slowly walked over. Finally, she stopped behind Su Fengyan and Shen Chongqing. She slowly took off her bridal hat, revealing a stunning face. More than 10 men from both sides forgot to curse at each other. Their eyes were all fixed on the woman's figure. The man who had already pulled out his saber kicked his drunk friend beside him. The latter's eyes were hazy. He looked at the woman in a daze and said that she was a fairy who had descended to the mortal world. Then he passed out again. Shen Chongqing, who was sitting on the ground, turned his head to look at the woman. When she sat between him and Su Fengyan, he still thought that he was seeing things because he was drunk. Su Fengyan laughed and asked, "Why did you change your purple clothes? Are you afraid that you'll be recognized with the way you appeared just now?" The woman with 2 exquisite wine jugs silently threw a jug of wine to Su Fengyan and started drinking on her own. For some reason, when this strange woman sat down, everyone around Su Fengyan sobered up. The Jianghu ruffians next door who were about to fight also lost their temper. They all held their breaths and didn't even dare to breathe loudly. She was like a flood dragon entering a pond, intimidating all the fish and shrimps in it. Su Fengyan whispered in a mysterious voice that only she could hear, "I'll give you the Tide Listening Pavilion's martial arts manual, and you'll let the Jianghu of the Central Plains know about the battle in Bailiang. Let's call it even." She didn't turn her head. She only drank her wine with a cold smile on her lips. "Does my Mount Hui want your manual?" Su Fengyan laughed and said, "Then tell me, what do you want?" She finally turned her head and looked at him with narrowed eyes. "Rumors of your battle with Tuoba Bodhisattva have already begun to spread in Liang Lake. I want you, Su Fengyan, to lose to me here today. What do you think?" Su Fengyan clicked his tongue and said, "You're a virgin who hasn't been married, yet you have so many sons and grandsons. Aren't you ashamed?" Her fingers suddenly tightened around the wine jug. Wisps of purple energy rose, but they disappeared in an instant. Su Fengyan ignored this and said with a smile, "Drinking is fine, but fighting is out of the question." He and she fell silent at the same time and looked into the distance. It was just like when they were looking at the snowman called Dream under the eaves of the capital. Chapter 1491. Chapter 3. It's definitely very late. The reunion, after a long time, after the two drank all the wine in the pot, parted on bad terms. For the first time, the talkative Shen Chongqing did not say a word from beginning to end. It was only when the woman put on the veil that covered her face and walked straight into the small town that he suddenly woke up from his absent-minded state. He carefully used his elbow to hit Su Fengyan and asked curiously, "An acquaintance?" Su Fengyan smiled and said, "You can say that." She was never a woman that was pleasing to the eye. Shen Chongging quickly sat upright and said sincerely, "She's so beautiful and her temper is bad. That's normal. To be honest, such an outstanding woman, you won't be able to find her again after this village. Don't miss this opportunity just for the sake of face. What nonsense about brothers being brothers and women being like clothes. We'll just listen to it and forget about it, but if we take it seriously, we'll be stupid. If you ask me, it's right to not take off your clothes when your hands can break." Su Fengnian could not help but smile and said, "I think you'll definitely find a beautiful wife in the future. When the time comes, you two will walk the Jianghu hand in hand." Shen Chongging rubbed his hands and said with a face full of fascination, "I'll take your auspicious words." Su Fengnian suddenly saw a familiar figure in the distance carrying a sword box and walking alone. He hesitated for a moment, then got up and said goodbye to Shen Chongging, leading the horse away. When Su Fengnian apologized again and began to approach the desolate young man carrying the box, the latter quickly turned his head and looked. When he saw Su Fengnian, he had a shocked expression that was similar to seeing his own ancestors floating out from the grave. The originally eye-catching arrogant demeanor of an aristocratic family was completely broken. He hurriedly trotted to Su Fengnian. If not for the fact that he was worried that his behavior of kneeling down and kowtowing would be too shocking, this young man with 4 famous swords in the box would have done so long ago. At this time he only cupped his fists and said softly with red eyes, "Zhang Chunlin of Yian Mountain Villa pays his respects to benefactor." At that time, before Su Fengnian and Han Xingxuan's life and death battle, the heavy snow blocked the road, so he stayed in Yian Mountain Villa with Wang Xiaoping, Xinyuan Qingfeng and the others. During that time when he was fishing, he encountered a group of white-clothed qi cultivators who were like immortals. He was swayed by his emotions and saved Zhang Chunlin's parents. After that, he also took away the swords such as Long Su Feng and Slender Waist. Now Yian Mountain Villa's luck had changed. Zhang Bingling, who had untied the knot in his heart, joined hands with his wife to reforge the sword. More than 10 famous swords with unparalleled sharpness came out one after another. The villa became famous and became one of the new top 10 sects in one fell swoop. As Su Fengnian became famous all over the world, Yian Mountain Villa also deduced the hidden identity of Su Fengnian based on the clues. Zhang Chunlin, who had always been longing for Jianghu, naturally regarded Su Fengnian as his benefactor and immortal. This time he left the protection of his parents' wings and left the villa in order to go to Beiliang to find the sword Immortal Senior, that he had once mistakenly thought was a white-haired, ruddy-faced but aged 100 years old. He wanted to express his gratitude to the young king of the northwest border in person on behalf of his parents and the villa. As for the plan that was buried deep in his heart that he did not even tell his parents, Zhang Chunlin became more and more determined along the way. Su Fengnian joked, "At that time I was fooling people. My hair was all white. It's not easy for child Zhang to recognize me." Zhang Chunlin unconsciously blurted out, "Even if I turned into ashes, I would still recognize you." Then the young master of Yian Mountain Villa was dumbstruck. He wished he could slap himself twice to vent his anger. Su Fengnian dismissed it with a smile and casually asked, "Why are you alone?" Zhang Chunlin, who did not even know where to place his hands, blushed and said, "I also got to know some Jianghu disciples of the big sections. But they gathered quickly and dispersed quickly. In the end there were only 2 or 3 close friends left. It's a pity that we were close to this small town. Those people had to travel with the elders of the sections. I really could not get used to seeing some things that had already been established, so I found an excuse to leave." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "When one is in Jianghu, one has to do as the Romans do." Su Fengnian also did not want to speak such old-fashioned preaching words to a person of the same age. He quickly changed the topic. "The 4 swords in the case, other than the rootless sky water that I saw that year, the 3 new swords all came from the Dragon Cliff sword furnace?" Zhang Chunlin stretched out his hand and patted the sword case behind him. He grinned and said, "There are 2 swords from the Dragon Cliff incense burner, named Fledgling and Monk's Hut. The Water Dragon Song sword furnace that had not been opened for 120 years was also opened at the end of last year. The sword's body was as clear as ice and snow, and the sword's body had a natural curve that was suspected of breaking the rules. In memory of my benefactor, I boldly named it Frost Blade." They were still about 200 steps away from the entrance of the town. There were many tents and it was getting more and more difficult to move forward. especially when Su Fengnian was leading the horse at an inappropriate time. Naturally, people rolled their eyes at him. Influenced by his simple family style, Zhang Chunlin had always been a well-educated and kind young man. However, when he saw his benefactor apologizing to others, the young and vigorous Zhang Chunlin was still somewhat angry. He felt that it was not worth it for his benefactor to apologize to others, but at the same time he constantly reminded himself not to ruin his benefactor's great plans. When Su Fengnian and his horse were unable to pass through the crowd, he said to Zhang Chunlin, "I won't send you into the town. I still have to return to Liangzhou." Zhang Chunlin was once again stunned on the spot. "Benefactor, you're not going in?" Su Fengnian said self-deprecatingly, "I won't join in the fun. The war at the border is urgent. You should have heard that I was chased all the way to the south by Tuoba Bodhisattva. I have to hurry back now." Zhang Chunlin wanted to say something but stopped. His ears were red to his neck and his eyes were wandering. It was obvious that he was in a dilemma. Su Fengnian seemed to have seen through his thoughts. He smiled freely and said, "If you want to enter the Bailiang Frontier Army because you want to repay a debt of gratitude, I'll be honest. In fact, there's no need. First of all, your Yuan Mountain Villa has given me a sword twice, so you don't owe me anything. Second of all, Jianghu men have been in Jianghu for a long time. The soldiers at the border will die at the border. This has always been the case." Just as Zhang Chunlin was about to speak, two groups of people arrived. Behind them was Shin Chongging, whom Su Fengnian had met by chance. The three people who came out of the town were Zhang Chunlin's rare friends. The difference in status between the two sides was like heaven and earth. The difference in bearing and demeanor was also huge. Therefore, when the three people stood beside Zhang Chunlin and the timid Shin Chongging stood beside Su Fengnian, the two groups were clearly separated. Even if the three young men did not show the slightest contempt, they were only a few steps away from Shin Chongging as far as the horizon. Su Fengnian did not have any sighs about this. That time at the Baogua Temple in Gangnam-do, the poor scholar Chen Shiliang sat at the same table as those famous people. Was it not the same? Although Zhang Chunlin was on good terms with the three people of the same age, he had never revealed Su Fengnian's identity. When talking about the fight for the flying sword that happened on the lake of the villa, Zhang Chunlin only said that he met a sword immortal senior who had concealed his identity. His white hair was like frost and he had countless flying swords. He was a genuine immortal.